Hello, and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. On the morning of the 7th of October, in the year 1571, a 24-year-old Spanish soldier named Miguel de Cervantes lay below the deck of a galley called the Marquesa, burning with a fever so severe that the ship's own captain and several of his own comrades had already told him plainly to stay below and let the fit pass, because a man shaking with malarial chills had no business standing at an oar-deck rail waiting for Ottoman cannon fire to find him. Cervantes, who would not write a single word of the novel that would eventually make him famous for another 34 years, got up anyway, dressed himself, and asked his own captain for a post. And when the captain, understandably reluctant to hand a weapon to a man who could barely stand, offered to let him stay below in the ship's own launch, where the sick and the unarmed were kept out of the worst of the fighting, Cervantes refused that too, telling the men around him, according to the accounts several of his own fellow soldiers would later give, that he would rather die fighting for God and for his king than live sheltering below decks while other men did the fighting for him. He was given a post at the ship's own boat, alongside a dozen other soldiers, and he held it through 6 hours of what would become, by the time the sun went down over a narrow gulf on the western coast of Greece that same evening, one of the largest naval battles fought anywhere in the world before the age of steam, a battle that would leave Cervantes with 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, and a third that shattered his left hand so completely that he lost the use of it for the rest of his life, a wound he would carry, in his own words recorded decades later, not as a disfigurement, but as a badge, earned, he said, in the most exalted occasion that past centuries have seen or future ages can ever hope to see. Cervantes was one of perhaps 140,000 men crowded, that same October morning, onto more than 400 ships packed into a gulf barely wide enough to hold them all. Christian galleys flying the banners of Spain, Venice, the Papal States, Genoa, and half a dozen smaller Italian states arrayed against an Ottoman fleet that had, for the better part of 2 generations, treated the Mediterranean Sea as very nearly its own private lake. And by the time the sun set that evening, somewhere between 25 and 30,000 of those 140,000 men would be dead, drowned, or bleeding out on deck slick with blood, in a single afternoon of oar-powered close-quarter slaughter that European observers, almost as soon as the news reached them, began calling the greatest naval battle since ancient times, and that a great many of them, in the genuine and often desperate relief of the moment, believed had just saved Christian Europe itself from an enemy fleet many of them had spent their entire adult lives afraid of. This whole long night belongs to that battle, the Battle of Lepanto, and to the considerably longer and considerably less dramatic chain of decisions, alliances, betrayals, sieges, and one very small, very stubborn island that actually produced it. Because a battle this famous, like nearly every single event this channel has ever carried you through, in the small hours of the night, did not simply happen on a single Sunday morning in a gulf off the Greek coast. It was assembled piece by piece across decades of Ottoman naval expansion, Venetian anxiety, papal diplomacy, and one sultan's own decision to go to war over an island prized above nearly everything else it produced for its wine. And this account is going to walk you through every one of those pieces before it ever lets you hear the first Ottoman cannon fire across that narrow water. It is a story this channel is not going to tell you as a simple tale of Christian Europe rescued at the last possible hour by a coalition of righteous allies, however satisfying that version has remained in Western memory for the better part of 4.5 centuries now, because the truth sitting underneath the legend is, as it very nearly always is once you actually go looking for it, considerably messier and considerably more human than the marble statues and the votive paintings would have you believe. It is a story about a Venetian governor whose own skin was stuffed with straw and paraded through a captured city after his own besiegers broke the terms of his own surrender. It is a story about a 24-year-old king's illegitimate half-brother handed command of the largest fleet Christian Europe had assembled in living memory, and about a coalition of allies who distrusted one another nearly as much as they distrusted the enemy they had gathered to fight. It is a story about tens of thousands of galley slaves, chained to their own oars on both sides of this same battle, Christian captives rowing Ottoman ships and Muslim captives rowing Christian ones, men who had no say whatsoever in the outcome of a fight that would decide whether they lived or drowned, chained, either way, to the very benches beneath the fighting. And it is, in the end, a story about how completely a single afternoon's victory can be misremembered in the centuries that follow it as having settled something that, in the cold arithmetic of the following 2 years, it turned out not to have settled at all. Before this story carries you any further out onto that water, take a moment. If these long and unhurried histories are the kind of thing you find worth your own time, to like this video and subscribe. And if you would like to help this small channel along its own slow way, from where it currently sits toward 10,000 subscribers, know that every single one of you listening tonight is already doing exactly that just by being here. If you're watching this on YouTube tonight, you will find a link waiting for you down in the description that takes you to this same story on Spotify for creators, where new episodes from this channel actually go up first, days before they ever reach this platform. And if you are hearing my voice tonight through Spotify instead, go search for Historian at midnight on YouTube and subscribe there as well, so that this small audience, split as it currently is across 2 different platforms, can gradually become one. And if you would like to leave some small trace of yourself behind before you drift off, drop your city and your local time in the comments. Nothing more than that, because there is something quietly comforting about knowing that somewhere else on this turning planet, in an hour and under a sky entirely different from your own, another tired stranger is settling in for this same slow story. Let whatever weight the day left on you slide off now. You do not have to carry the inbox, the argument, the thing you meant to say differently, into whatever hours are left of this night. Leave it folded on a chair somewhere outside this room, and let it wait there until the sun finds it again tomorrow. Sink down into whatever is holding you up right now. Let your breathing find its own slower rhythm, and let this voice carry you backward across 455 years, past the wars and the treaties and the popes and the sultans still waiting for you in the hours ahead, to a Mediterranean sea that 2 empires had spent most of a century quietly, and not so quietly, trying to decide which of them actually owned it. A sea 2 empires both believed was theirs. To understand why a fleet of 400 ships came to be crowded into a narrow Greek gulf on an October morning in 1571, it helps to go back a full century further still, to a spring morning in 1453, when Ottoman cannon finally breached the walls of Constantinople and brought down, in a single campaigning season, the last remnant of an empire that had stood, in one form or another, for well over 1,000 years. That conquest, and the century of Ottoman expansion that followed it, under a line of sultans who understood naval power as inseparable from the empire's own continued growth, is a story this channel has already told you in full on another night. And it is not the story tonight is going to retell, but it is worth naming plainly, before this account moves forward even one more sentence, exactly what that conquest actually meant for every Christian power with a coastline anywhere near the Eastern Mediterranean, because an empire that had taken the greatest fortified city in the Christian world did not simply stop at its own new capital's walls. Ottoman fleets pushed steadily westward and southward across the following decades into the Aegean, along the coasts of the Balkans and North Africa, absorbing island after island and port after port that had for centuries flown Venetian, Genoese or Byzantine colours, until by the middle of the 16th century an Ottoman sultan could plausibly claim to command the single most powerful navy the Mediterranean had seen assembled under one flag since the height of ancient Rome. The sultan who pushed that same naval expansion furthest, and whose own shadow falls across nearly every decision this account is about to describe, was Suleiman, called the Magnificent by the Europeans who feared him and the lawgiver by his own subjects. A sultan whose reign, spanning nearly the whole of the middle decades of the 16th century, this channel has already devoted an entire evening's telling to in full, and it is enough for tonight's purposes to name plainly the specific naval legacy Suleiman actually left behind him, because it was under Suleiman's own patronage that a Barbary corsair named Hayreddin Barbarossa, a red-bearded pirate admiral whose own career had begun raiding Christian shipping out of North African ports, rose to become Capudan Pasha, Grand Admiral of the entire Ottoman fleet, and led that fleet in 1538 to a crushing victory over a combined Christian armada at the Battle of Preveza, a defeat so complete that it left Ottoman galleys operating with something close to free rein across the central and western Mediterranean for a generation afterward, raiding the coasts of Italy and Spain almost at will, carrying off tens of thousands of Christian captives into slavery across those same decades, and leaving an entire generation of coastal Italians, Spaniards and southern French to grow up genuinely uncertain whether the next summer would bring a raiding fleet to their own shore. Consider for a moment exactly how that single battle off the western coast of Greece in 1538 actually unfolded, because Preveza involved a Christian fleet, assembled under the overall command of the Genoese admiral Andrea Doria, the very grandfather of the same Gianandrea Doria this account will introduce you to properly in the hours still ahead of you tonight, that actually outnumbered Barbarossa's own Ottoman force in raw ship count, and yet Doria, facing an Ottoman fleet arrayed with real tactical discipline in a strong defensive position along the coast, chose, after a day of largely indecisive manoeuvring and light skirmishing, to withdraw rather than commit his own fleet to a full engagement, a decision several contemporary and a great many later historians have judged excessively cautious, and one that let a considerably smaller Ottoman force claim what would be remembered for the following 3 decades as a genuine and decisive Ottoman naval triumph, simply by virtue of having been the fleet still holding the field once the Christian withdrawal was complete, a pattern of Genoese caution under Doria family command that a careful listener may want to hold in mind for when this same family name returns to this story on a considerably larger and considerably more consequential stage. It is hard not to notice, too, a specific and genuinely uncomfortable alliance that shaped the broader diplomatic weather across these same decades, because the Kingdom of France, locked in its own long rivalry with the Habsburg dynasty ruling both Spain and, for a time, the Holy Roman Empire at once, had entered, under its own King Francis I, into a working diplomatic and occasionally military partnership with Suleiman's own Ottoman court, a Christian kingdom allying itself, in practical terms, with the single most powerful Muslim empire in the world, specifically to pressure a fellow Christian dynasty it regarded as the more immediate and more dangerous rival, an alliance that produced in 1543 the genuinely startling spectacle of Barbarossa's own Ottoman fleet wintering in the French port of Toulon. French cathedral, bells silenced, and a mosque improvised within the town for the duration of the Ottoman fleet's own stay, a single winter's arrangement that scandalised a great many observers across Catholic Europe, and that this account names here plainly because it complicates, usefully, any simple story of a unified Christian Europe standing shoulder to shoulder against a foreign Ottoman threat, when in fact the single most powerful Catholic kingdom on the European continent had spent a considerable portion of the preceding decades treating that same Ottoman court as a useful diplomatic partner against its own Christian rivals, whenever doing so served French interests. Consider, too, exactly how personally frightening this same Ottoman naval dominance felt to the ordinary populations living along the Mediterranean's northern coastline, because this was not for the fishing villages and the small port towns of southern Italy, Sicily and coastal Spain, some distant strategic abstraction debated only in the council chambers of kings, but a lived and recurring terror, watchtowers built along entire stretches of coastline specifically to give warning of an approaching corsair sail, church bells rung in a specific pattern, reserved only for raiders spotted offshore, and a slave market in Ottoman Algiers and Tunis that, across the 16th and 17th centuries combined, would eventually process something in the range of 1 million European captives, taken from raided villages and captured ships alike, sold into households and galleys across the whole of the Ottoman Mediterranean, A specific and considerable human cost of this same naval rivalry, paid overwhelmingly by people whose own names never once appeared in any treaty or any royal chronicle, that rarely makes it into the grander accounts of sultans and kings, but that shaped, more than almost anything else, exactly how ordinary Christian Europeans along that coastline actually understood what was at stake whenever a new Ottoman fleet put to sea. It is worth naming briefly exactly who Barbarossa actually was before this account moves any further forward, because his own career traces a path that a great many of the Ottoman Navy's own most feared commanders across this whole century would follow in one form or another. A Greek-born corsair, one of several brothers who began their own careers raiding Christian shipping as freelance operators out of North African ports, entirely independent of Constantinople's own authority, before Hayreddin, the younger and more capable of the surviving brothers, offered his own considerable fleet and his own considerable experience into formal Ottoman service, a bargain Suleiman accepted eagerly, because it gave the Sultan, in a single stroke, access to a body of specifically corsair naval expertise, small, fast, shallow-drafted raiding tactics honed across decades of independent piracy that the Empire's own more conventional naval institutions had never fully developed on their own. Barbarossa's own eventual successor as the single most feared corsair admiral in Ottoman service, a Muslim convert originally born in Ottoman Anatolia named Turgut Reis, known to Christian Europe as Dragut, continued this same tradition after Barbarossa's own death in 1546, raiding the coasts of Italy and Spain for a further 2 decades, with a ferocity several contemporary accounts describe as exceeding even Barbarossa's own considerable reputation, and it was Dragut himself who died at the Great Siege of Malta. This account has already told you about, struck by cannon fire during the siege's opening weeks, a death that removed from the Ottoman fleet's own command structure one of its single most experienced and most feared commanders only months before that same siege's own ultimate failure. Consider too exactly how galley warfare itself had evolved across the centuries leading up to this same battle, because the ancient world's own preferred tactic, ramming an enemy vessel with a reinforced bronze beak mounted at the bow to hole and sink it outright, had, by the 16th century, given way almost entirely to a considerably different approach. Ships built with a raised, spur-like bow structure used less to puncture an enemy hull below the waterline than to ride up over an enemy vessel's own oarbanks, sweeping them away and immobilizing the ship before grappling hooks and boarding parties settled the actual engagement hand-to-hand. A shift driven largely by the introduction of cannon, which made a direct underwater ramming strike considerably less necessary, when a well-placed shot from a bow-mounted gun could disable an enemy vessel from a distance, before the ships ever closed at all. A tactical evolution that meant the battle this account is building toward would be decided in the end, considerably more by cannon fire and by hand-to-hand infantry combat than by anything resembling the ship-to-ship ramming tactics a viewer familiar only with ancient naval warfare might otherwise expect. Christian resistance to this same Ottoman naval momentum did not come from any single unified command, because the Mediterranean's Christian powers spent most of the 16th century almost as suspicious of one another as they were of the Ottomans themselves, a fractured and often self-defeating rivalry this account will return to again and again across tonight's telling. Spain, under Charles V, and later his son Philip II, maintained the single largest Western Mediterranean fleet and the deepest treasury to fund it, but Spanish attention was pulled constantly toward the Atlantic, toward the Americas, toward wars in Northern Europe, and toward a Protestant Reformation that Philip regarded as at least as urgent a threat to Catholic Christendom as any Ottoman fleet. Venice, by contrast, possessed neither Spain's silver nor its continental armies, but held something arguably more valuable in this specific contest: the single most experienced and most professionally organised navy anywhere in Christian Europe, built and maintained through the Republic's own famous arsenal, a state shipyard capable, by the middle of the 16th century, of assembling a fully rigged war galley from raw timber in less than a single day when the need genuinely demanded it, an industrial capacity for warship production that no other power in Europe, Ottoman or Christian, could fully match. And it was Venice, more than any other Christian state, that actually had to live year after year alongside this same Ottoman naval power, because the Venetian Republic had spent 3 centuries building a maritime trading empire that stretched from the Lagoon of Venice itself down the Dalmatian coast, through the Ionian and Aegean islands, and all the way to Cyprus and beyond, a network of ports, colonies, and trading privileges that generated the wealth on which the entire Republic's own survival depended, and that sat almost every mile of it directly astride territory the Ottoman Empire was steadily absorbing. It is worth remembering that Venice and the Ottoman Empire were not, for most of this same period, locked in continuous open warfare, because the Republic's own governing council, the Senate, understood with a clarity that would sometimes frustrate its own more zealous Christian allies that Venetian prosperity depended far more on stable trading relationships with Constantinople than on any crusading fervour against it, and Venice accordingly fought a long series of separate limited wars against the Ottomans across the 15th and 16th centuries, punctuated by long stretches of careful, profitable, and occasionally quite cynical peace, losing territory in most of those wars, an island here, a fortress town there, but always negotiating a settlement afterward that preserved enough of the Republic's own trading position in the eastern Mediterranean to keep its own merchant fleets moving. This pattern, a war fought reluctantly, a peace negotiated pragmatically, a trading relationship resumed almost as soon as the ink dried, had repeated itself often enough by the middle of the 16th century that a great many observers across Europe, including a fair number inside the Ottoman court itself, had come to assume it would simply repeat itself again the next time Constantinople decided it wanted something Venice currently held, an assumption that would prove, in the specific case this account is building toward, both largely correct and, in one crucial respect, catastrophically wrong for the tens of thousands of people who would not survive to see the peace that eventually followed. Consider for a moment exactly how much territory this same slow, grinding pattern had already cost Venice by the time this story's own war finally arrived, because the Cyprus campaign this account is building toward was not, by any means, the first time an Ottoman Sultan had decided to take something Venice held in the eastern Mediterranean, and it is worth naming, briefly, the earlier losses that had already taught Venetian statesmen exactly how this same story tended to end. The Republic had lost the fortress city of Negroponte, on the island of Euboea, to Mehmed II's own forces in 1470, a defeat that shocked Christian Europe nearly as badly in its own day as Nicosia's fall would shock it a full century later, and had lost, across a further war fought in the opening years of the 16th century, the important Peloponnesian fortress ports of Modon and Coron as well, each loss following the same broad pattern, a costly and ultimately unsuccessful Venetian defence, a negotiated peace that formally recognised the Ottoman gain, and a resumption, within a matter of years, of the same profitable trading relationship that had existed before the war began, a pattern so well established by 1570 that Venice's own governing Senate, weighing its own vote on Selim's ultimatum, understood with genuine and sober clarity exactly what kind of outcome history suggested it should expect, and voted to refuse the ultimatum anyway. A choice this account has already told you reflected real anguish rather than any naive confidence that the outcome might somehow prove different this time. A city terrorised by name alone. It is worth returning to the Corsair raiding this account described earlier in considerably general terms, because a handful of specific and genuinely famous incidents did more than any abstract description of coastal fear ever could to fix Barbary Corsair power in the imagination of an entire generation of Italians and Spaniards. Barbarossa's own fleet, sailing in alliance with France, as this account has already told you, raided the Italian coastline repeatedly across the 1540s, sacking the town of Reggio Calabria so thoroughly in 1543 that Ottoman sources themselves recorded the operation as a particular point of pride, and raiding along the Bay of Naples and the coast near Rome itself closely enough, in a separate operation the following year led by another Corsair captain, that the city of Ostia, sitting at the very mouth of the Tiber and only a short march from Rome's own walls, was sacked in a raid that sent a genuine wave of panic through the papal court itself, contemporary reports describing the Pope of that same period considering, in real and serious alarm, whether Rome itself might need to prepare its own defences against a Corsair fleet operating by that point, with an audacity that made no coastal city in Christian Italy feel entirely safe any longer. It was precisely this same accumulated memory, a full generation of raids reaching close enough to Rome to frighten a pope in his own palace, that gave Pius V's own later crusading urgency, the urgency that would eventually assemble the Holy League this account has already told you about, its own real and specific emotional force, because Pius was not summoning Catholic Europe to fight some distant and abstract threat, but a threat that had, within living memory, come close enough to his own city's gates to be smelled on the wind. Coastal Spain carried its own equally vivid memory of this same danger, Corsair raids striking the shores of Valencia, Andalusia, and the Balearic Islands with enough regularity across these same decades that entire stretches of the Spanish coastline maintained standing militias and networks of signal towers specifically dedicated to Corsair defence, a defensive infrastructure so extensive and so deeply woven into ordinary Spanish coastal life that traces of it, watchtowers repurposed or simply left standing empty across the centuries since, remain visible along that same coastline to any traveller who knows to look for them today. The knights who would not leave the sea. Before this account can bring you to Cyprus, it needs to bring you first to two much smaller pieces of ground, because the specific fear that would eventually drive a fractured, mutually suspicious Christian coalition to actually put a combined fleet to sea in 1571 had been building in the collective memory of Christian Europe's own coastal populations across two earlier sieges that this channel has, until tonight, only mentioned in passing on other nights, and that deserve, before this story moves any further forward, their own proper telling. The Knights Hospitaller, a military religious order tracing its own origins back to the Crusades this channel has already spent several long nights walking you through, had been driven from their own base on the island of Rhodes in 1522, after a 6-month siege in which a young Suleiman, only recently crowned and eager to establish his own martial reputation, brought overwhelming force against a garrison that fought with a stubbornness that impressed even the Sultan, who eventually defeated it. And it is worth naming, honestly, that Suleiman's own conduct at the siege's end reflected real and genuine magnanimity, granting the surviving knights safe passage off the island, along with their own arms, their own relics, and any of the island's own Christian population who wished to leave with them, a mercy the young Sultan would have real and specific reason to regret 4 decades later. The knights, expelled from Rhodes, spent the following 8 years as a homeless order before the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V granted them the island of Malta in 1530, a barren, rocky outpost that the knights transformed, across the following decades, into one of the most heavily fortified positions in the entire Mediterranean, and it was against this same fortified island that Suleiman, now an old man well past 70, and only a single year from his own death, sent an armada carrying somewhere in the range of 30 to 40,000 men in the spring of 1565, determined to finish, once and for all, the business he had left unresolved 43 years earlier at Rhodes. The great siege of Malta that followed across that entire summer produced exactly the kind of grinding, monstrously costly struggle that a fortress held by men who genuinely believed themselves fighting for the survival of their entire order tends to produce, the small outer fort of St. Elmo falling only after weeks of assault so ferocious that Ottoman commanders themselves described the ground surrounding it as unrecognisable, beneath its own accumulated dead, and the main defences at Birgu and Senglea held under the command of the knight's own aging grandmaster, a French nobleman named Jean Parisot de Valette, who was already past 70 himself, and who personally took up arms alongside his own men during the siege's most desperate assaults, refusing to break through 4 months of heat, disease, and mounting Ottoman losses until a relief force finally arrived from Spanish Sicily that September, and the exhausted Ottoman army, having lost, by several careful modern estimates, close to a third of the men it had originally landed with, withdrew in defeat. The failure at Malta mattered enormously to everything this account is about to describe, because it was read, almost immediately and across every court in Christian Europe, as the first genuine sign that Ottoman naval momentum, unbroken across the entire Mediterranean since Barbarossa's own victory at Preveza a quarter-century earlier, had finally begun to falter, and it gave a Christian world that had spent decades assuming Ottoman naval supremacy was simply a fixed feature of the world it lived in its first real evidence, however costly and however narrow, that the Ottoman fleet could, in fact, be beaten. It is worth remembering too the specific and rather bitter irony that would only become visible in hindsight because the same mercy a 28-year-old Suleiman had extended to the defeated Knights of Rhodes in 1522 had grown, across the following 4 decades, into an adversary formidable enough to hand a 70-year-old Suleiman the single costliest defeat of his entire reign, and Suleiman himself would be dead within a year of that same defeat, felled not by any Christian sword, but by illness in a military tent outside the Hungarian fortress town of Szigetvar in September of 1566, leaving the empire he had spent 46 years building at its own absolute territorial and military height, to a son whose own reputation, fairly or not, would never come close to matching his father's. It is hard not to notice, briefly, exactly what the Knights of Malta actually did with the decades of relative peace that followed their own successful defence of the island in 1565, because the order, its own religious mission by this point in its history, focused almost entirely on continuous naval warfare against Ottoman and Barbary shipping, built its own considerable fleet into one of the most active and most feared privateering forces in the entire Mediterranean, conducting what contemporaries called the Corso, a continuous campaign of raiding Muslim merchant and pilgrim shipping that generated real and substantial revenue for the order through captured cargo and, above all, through captured crews sold or ransomed as slaves, a specific irony worth sitting with for a moment, because the very order Christian Europe celebrated as the heroic defenders of Malta against Ottoman slaving and raiding conducted in the decades on either side of that same famous siege an almost mirror-image campaign of its own raiding and enslaving against Muslim shipping, a symmetry this account has already shown you defined nearly every other corner of this long Mediterranean rivalry, and that the Knights' own contribution to the fleet gathering at Messina in 1571, several galleys and several hundred experienced fighting men, represents simply one further chapter of. That son was Selim, the second sultan to carry that name, and it is with Selim, and with the specific and rather unglamorous appetite history has remembered him for, that this account is finally ready to turn toward the island whose loss would set this entire war into motion. A sultan remembered, unfairly or not, for his wine. Selim II came to the Ottoman throne in September of 1566 at the age of 42, the sole surviving son of Suleiman after a brutal decades-long succession struggle. This channel described in full on another night, a struggle that had already claimed the lives of 2 of Selim's own brothers and left Selim himself, by the time his father finally died, as the unchallenged heir to an empire stretching from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, from the Barbary coast to the Arabian Peninsula. History, both Ottoman and European, has not generally been kind to Selim in the way it remembers his father, and it is worth naming honestly, before this account repeats the nickname that follows him through nearly every history book written since. Exactly how that reputation was earned, and exactly how much of it deserves to be taken at face value. Selim was known across his own court, and increasingly across the courts of Europe that received reports about him, as Selim the Sot, a nickname attached to him on account of a fondness for wine that stood in genuinely stark and, to Ottoman court chroniclers writing under the strict religious prohibitions of Islamic law, genuinely scandalous contrast to the public piety his own father had spent a lifetime cultivating. It is worth pausing on how much weight that same nickname can actually bear, because a great many modern historians looking back at the considerably more complicated record Selim actually left behind him have suggested that Selim the Sot flattens a more capable and more politically engaged ruler into a caricature that served the interests of exactly the people most invested in explaining away Ottoman military setbacks during his own reign, without having to blame the empire's own institutions or its own overextension. Selim did preside over a court less personally austere than his father's, did maintain a well-documented taste for wine that his own religious advisers periodically and unsuccessfully urged him to abandon, and did delegate an unusually large share of the actual day-to-day business of governing his own vast empire to his Grand Vizier, a Bosnian-born statesman named Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, who had already served with real distinction under Suleiman, and who would go on to hold the office of Grand Vizier for an extraordinary 14 years across 2 different sultans' reigns, a span of authority that made Sokolu, by the time this story's own war actually breaks out, arguably the single most powerful and most experienced statesman anywhere in the Ottoman government, considerably more experienced in matters of state than the sultan he nominally served. It is worth naming, briefly, exactly where a man like Sokolu Mehmed Pasha actually came from, because his own career traces back to the Devshirme, the Ottoman Empire's own centuries-old practice of periodically levying young Christian boys from villages across the empire's Balkan provinces, converting them to Islam, and training them for careers in either the Janissary Infantry Corps or, for the small number who showed particular aptitude, the empire's own administrative and military elite, a system this channel has already described in fuller detail on another night, and that produced, across the 16th century, an extraordinary number of the Ottoman Empire's own most powerful Grand Viziers and provincial governors, men born as Christian villagers in Bosnia, Albania or Greece who rose, through this same forced conscription and subsequent genuine meritocratic advancement, to command armies and administer provinces on behalf of the same empire that had first taken them from their own families as children, a specific and genuinely strange institutional inheritance worth holding in mind, against Uluç Ali's own remarkably similar path from a Calabrian fisherman's son to Ottoman Grand Admiral, because the empire arrayed against the Holy League in 1571 was led, at nearly every senior level, by men who had not been born Muslim, or Ottoman, or Turkish at all, but had become all three across the course of careers this same empire's own institutions had made possible in ways very few contemporary Christian states could have matched. And it is worth naming, too, exactly how the Ottoman Empire actually managed to build and rebuild fleets on the scale this account has already described, because the empire maintained, at Constantinople itself, a naval shipyard, the Tersain, whose own scale rivaled and in certain respects exceeded even Venice's own famous arsenal, drawing on timber resources from across the Black Sea coast, and the empire's own Balkan and Anatolian forests that dwarfed what any single Christian Mediterranean power could draw on from its own territory alone, an industrial capacity for warship construction that explains, better than any single administrator's own competence could on its own, exactly how Sokolu Mehmed Pasha was able to promise, and actually deliver, a rebuilt Ottoman fleet within a single winter of the catastrophe this account is about to walk you through in full. It is worth remembering plainly exactly what Sokolu Mehmed Pasha's own considerable influence meant for the specific decision that would eventually drag the Ottoman Empire into a war with Venice, because a substantial body of surviving evidence, drawn from both Ottoman court records and the reports of European ambassadors resident in Constantinople at the time, suggests that Sokolu himself was genuinely reluctant to open a new front against Venice at all, preferring instead to preserve the long and profitable peace the two powers had maintained across most of the preceding decades. A peace that had allowed Venetian merchants continued access to Ottoman markets and had spared the treasury the enormous expense of a fresh Mediterranean war precisely at a moment when Ottoman military attention and resources remained heavily committed to the empire's own eastern and northern frontiers. The push toward war, when it came, arrived instead from a different and considerably more aggressive faction within Selim's own court. Men who saw in the specific island this account is about to introduce you to both a genuine strategic prize and, in the words several contemporary observers attributed to them, though this account cannot claim any of these attributed remarks survive with full documentary certainty, a specific and rather earthy appeal that had nothing whatsoever to do with strategy. An island prized above nearly everything else for its wine. The island in question was Cyprus, the largest island in the eastern Mediterranean, sitting close enough to the coast of Ottoman-controlled Syria and Anatolia that a man standing on a clear day at certain points along its own northern shore could, by several contemporary accounts, see the mainland across the water, and yet an island that had remained, for nearly 2 centuries by 1570, a Venetian possession, first ruled by the Frankish Lusinian dynasty, descended from the Crusader kingdoms this channel has already told you about on other nights, and then, from 1489 onward, ceded formally to Venice itself after the last Lusinian queen, Catherine Cornaro, a Venetian noblewoman by birth who had married into the island's own royal line, was persuaded, under considerable and not entirely gentle pressure from her own native republic, to abdicate her own throne in Venice's favour. Cyprus, under Venetian rule, had become, across the following 8 decades, an enormously profitable colony, its own fertile plains producing cotton, sugar, and above all a rich, sweet fortified wine that had, by the middle of the 16th century, become genuinely famous across the courts of Europe, prized specifically for a sweetness and a strength that no mainland European vineyard could quite reproduce. And it is this same specific wine, according to a persistent tradition recorded by several contemporary chroniclers on both the Ottoman and Christian sides, that gave Selim the particular and rather undignified motive later legend would attach most eagerly to his name. The story, as it has come down across 4.5 centuries of retelling, holds that Selim, already known across his own court for a taste in wine his father would never have tolerated so openly, had grown genuinely enamoured of the sweet Cypriot vintage his own merchants and diplomats brought back from the island, and that this same personal fondness, magnified and repeated by chroniclers eager to explain a war of conquest through a ruler's own private appetite, rather than through the colder calculations of state, became attached to Selim's own decision to invade in a way that turned a genuinely complicated strategic and religious justification into a single, memorable, and considerably more mockable anecdote. A sultan supposedly going to war for a glass of wine rather than for an empire's own considered interest. It is worth remembering honestly that most serious modern historians treat this same wine story with real scepticism, not because Selim's own fondness for Cypriot wine is in any real doubt, several independent sources confirm it, but because a ruler's personal taste for a particular vintage makes for a memorable story considerably more easily than it makes for an actual casus belli. And the real reason Selim's court settled on war with Venice in the winter of 1569 and 1570 were, as reasons for war very nearly always are once you look past the anecdote attached to them, considerably more calculated than a sultan's own private thirst. Consider for a moment the actual strategic and religious case Selim's war party assembled, because it drew on several genuinely distinct arguments worth separating out honestly rather than collapsing into a single simple motive. Cyprus sat, as this account has already told you, remarkably close to the Ottoman mainland, close enough that Venetian-flagged ships operating from Cypriot ports could, and by Ottoman accounts regularly did, harass Muslim pilgrim and merchant shipping, moving along the Anatolian and Syrian coast, a genuine and long-standing grievance that Ottoman officials had raised with Venice on more than one occasion across the preceding decades, without ever securing a settlement either side considered fully satisfactory. Cyprus also represented in the specific religious framing several Ottoman legal scholars were prepared to offer Selim's court land that had once belonged. In the deeper historical memory these same scholars were willing to invoke to Muslim rule before the crusading centuries this channel as already described took it away, a framing that let Selim's own advisers present a war of straightforward territorial conquest as a matter of restoring what an earlier age of Islamic rule had once possessed. A justification Ottoman jurisprudence took seriously enough that Selim's court reportedly sought and received a formal religious ruling, a fatwa, endorsing the legality of breaking the existing peace treaty with Venice specifically on these grounds, a legal manoeuvre that mattered considerably to an empire that took its own religious law seriously, even when that same law was being marshalled, as religious law so often has been across every century this channel has ever told you about, to justify a decision a ruling court had already substantially made on other grounds. The specific religious ruling Selim's court sought and received is generally credited to Ebu Suud Effendi, the empire's own senior Islamic legal authority, the Shaykhul Islam, a jurist who had already served in that same role for the better part of 3 decades under Suleiman, before continuing to hold it under Selim, and whose own considerable personal authority lent the coming war a legal and religious legitimacy that a less respected jurist's ruling could never have carried with quite the same weight across the empire's own religious establishment. It is worth naming too exactly how popular this same coming war actually was within the Ottoman Empire's own borders, because a war promising fresh territorial conquest, fresh plunder, and fresh captives for an empire's own considerable slave and ransom economy tended across this entire period to enjoy real and broad support among precisely the military and administrative classes whose own cooperation any sultan needed to actually wage it. A domestic political reality that gave the war party at Selim's own court a further and more immediate incentive to press their own case beyond the strategic and religious arguments this account has already laid out for you, because a young sultan, only 5 years into his own reign, following a father whose own military reputation had loomed as large as Suleiman's, had genuine and understandable political reasons of his own to want a decisive victory that would let him step out from under that same considerable shadow. The final days before contact, and a small boat that confirmed what everyone already feared. Consider too briefly exactly how the two fleets actually located one another across those final tense days at the start of October, because naval intelligence in this period depended almost entirely on scouting vessels, coastal informants, and the kind of second-hand rumour that travelled, not always reliably, from port to port ahead of any fleet's own actual movements, and Don Juan's own war council at Corfu received in the first days of October a stream of increasingly specific and increasingly consistent reports, carried by small scouting galleys and by local fishermen and coastal informants whose own knowledge of these waters vastly exceeded anything the assembled Christian commanders could claim on their own, confirming that the Ottoman fleet had indeed withdrawn into the sheltered anchorage near Lepanto this account has already told you about, intelligence reliable enough that Don Juan's own council could plan its own approach with genuine confidence, rather than simply sailing east in the hope of eventually stumbling across an enemy fleet somewhere in open water. And there was, finally, the plain strategic logic of consolidation, because an Ottoman Empire that already controlled the entire eastern and southern coastline of the Mediterranean's easternmost basin, Egypt, the Levant, most of Anatolia, gained comparatively little from tolerating a single large Venetian-held island sitting in the very middle of waters the empire otherwise dominated almost completely, and the war party at Selim's own court argued, with real strategic coherence whatever role a sultan's own thirst for sweet wine might also have played in the background, that Cyprus represented the single most glaring gap remaining in an otherwise consolidated Ottoman Eastern Mediterranean, a gap that would only grow more strategically awkward the longer it was allowed to persist. Venice, informed through its own extensive diplomatic and intelligence network that an Ottoman fleet and army were being assembled through the winter of 1569 into 1570, on a scale that could only be intended for a major campaign, spent those same months in a state of genuine and escalating anxiety, uncertain whether the target was Cyprus itself or some other Venetian possession, and sending increasingly urgent appeals to Rome, to Spain, and to every other Catholic power in Europe, warning that an Ottoman blow was coming, and that Venice alone, however formidable its own navy, could not hope to hold Cyprus against the full weight of an Ottoman invasion without meaningful outside help. An ultimatum, a refusal, and a fleet already at sea. The formal Ottoman declaration, when it finally arrived in Venice in the spring of 1570, took the shape of an ultimatum delivered by an Ottoman envoy demanding the peaceful surrender of Cyprus, a demand the Venetian Senate, after genuinely anguished internal debate weighing the real prospect of losing the island by force against the humiliation of surrendering it without a fight, voted to refuse, a decision that committed the Republic to a war its own most clear-eyed senators understood, even as they cast their own votes. Venice was very unlikely to win without substantial outside assistance that no other Christian power had yet actually promised to provide. It is worth remembering, honestly, that the Venetian Senate's own refusal did not arrive without a genuine and fairly desperate attempt to avoid war altogether in the months immediately preceding that final vote, because Venetian diplomats in Constantinople had spent the winter of 1569 and 1570 exploring. Through back channels, this account's own surviving evidence describes only in fragmentary outline whether some financial arrangement, an increased tribute payment, or a substantial one-time indemnity paid directly into the Ottoman treasury might satisfy Selim's own court in place of the island itself, an approach entirely consistent with the pragmatic, trade-preserving diplomacy this account has already told you Venice had practiced toward Constantinople for the better part of the preceding century, and an approach the war party at Selim's own court, having already committed itself publicly and religiously to the specific goal of Cyprus's conquest through the fatwa this account has already described, was no longer willing to accept on any terms short of the island's own outright surrender, a diplomatic door that had in effect already closed before Venice's own Senate ever cast the formal vote to refuse the ultimatum it had by then received. A commander from an old Roman family, and a fleet with 3 flags flying over one deck. It is worth naming, too, exactly how contested the question of supreme command actually was before Philip's own choice of Don Juan finally settled it, because the papal contingent of the fleet arrived at Messina under the command of Marcantonio Colonna, a member of one of Rome's own oldest and most distinguished noble families, a lineage that had produced popes, cardinals, and condottieri captains across 4 centuries of Italian history, and Colonna, holding his own commission directly from Pius V, arrived at Messina with a real and not unreasonable claim to at least share, if not to hold outright, supreme command of the combined fleet, a claim the Venetian Republic, sensitive to any arrangement that might subordinate its own considerable naval contribution to a young Spanish prince with no independent naval command experience of his own, watched with equally real unease. The final arrangement, worked out through weeks of careful diplomatic negotiation before the fleet ever departed Messina, gave Don Juan supreme and unambiguous command while formally honouring Colonna's own seniority and Venier's own standing through an elaborate protocol of consultation and shared decision-making that, this account has to note honestly, existed rather more clearly on paper than it did in the actual heat of the War Council debate this account has already described to you, a fragile diplomatic compromise that held in the end well enough to win the battle, but that reflected, at every level of its own construction, exactly the same mutual suspicion between Spain, Venice and Rome that had shaped nearly every stage of this coalition's own difficult birth. The Ottoman invasion fleet, numbering by most careful estimates somewhere in the range of 300 to 400 vessels, and carrying an invasion force of perhaps 60 to 80,000 soldiers under the command of a general named Lala Mustafa Pasha, a veteran commander who had already served Selim's father in several earlier campaigns, landed on the Cypriot coast near Limassol in the first days of July 1570, meeting only limited initial resistance from a Venetian garrison and Cypriot colonial defence force that numbered, across the entire island, barely a tenth of the invading army's own strength, a defensive imbalance that made the outcome of the coming campaign, in the narrowest military sense, very nearly a foregone conclusion from the moment the first Ottoman soldier waded ashore. It is hard not to notice, sitting with the arithmetic of that same imbalance for a moment, exactly how little, say, the ordinary population of Cyprus itself actually had in any of the decisions now bringing an army of tens of thousands onto their own farmland, because the island's Greek-speaking peasantry, who made up the overwhelming majority of Cyprus's own population, had lived for 8 decades under a Venetian colonial administration that a great many contemporary reports, including several written by Venetian officials themselves, describe as extractive and often genuinely resented heavy taxation, a rigid feudal labour system inherited from the earlier Lusignan centuries and preserved rather than reformed by Venice's own colonial governors and a Latin Catholic administrative class that held itself apart, socially and religiously, from an Orthodox Christian peasantry it governed but rarely consulted. Several Ottoman accounts written after the invasion, and a smaller number of surviving Venetian reports acknowledging the same uncomfortable truth, suggest that a meaningful portion of the island's own rural population greeted the arriving Ottoman army with something closer to resignation than resistance, and in a handful of documented cases with something that approached open welcome, a preference not for Ottoman rule specifically, but for any change at all to a colonial system that had extracted a great deal from Cypriot farmers across 8 decades while returning comparatively little in the way of genuine investment or protection, a detail this account owes you honestly before the siege that follows asks you to grieve, as it should, for the specific and considerable suffering the island's population was about to endure, regardless of which empire's flag eventually flew over it. The city that fell first and fell fast, Nicosia, the island's own capital and its most heavily fortified city, ringed by modern Venetian-designed walls that had been completed only a few years before the invasion at enormous expense specifically to withstand exactly this kind of siege, held out against the advancing Ottoman army for a little under 7 weeks, from the arrival of Lala Mustafa Pasha's forces outside its own walls in late July through the city's own fall on the 9th of September 1570, a defence conducted by a garrison that numbered, by most careful estimates, somewhere around 10 to 12,000 soldiers and armed civilians against an Ottoman besieging force many times that size, commanded by Lala Mustafa Pasha, a general who had already spent decades in Ottoman military service, including an earlier command in the empire's own long wars against Safavid Persia, and whose own considerable experience directing complex sieges would prove, across the following 13 months of campaigning on Cyprus, to be exactly the kind of patient, methodical competence this specific campaign actually required. And it is worth naming plainly that the defenders held out considerably longer than the raw disparity in numbers alone would have predicted, thanks in large part to the same modern fortifications Venice had spent a considerable fortune constructing, a star-shaped defensive design that gave defenders overlapping fields of fire against any direct assault, and that forced the besieging Ottoman army into weeks of grinding trench work and repeated costly assaults before the walls finally gave way. What happened once those walls finally did give way, on the morning of the 9th of September, has become, across 4.5 centuries of retelling on both sides of this same conflict, one of the most disputed and most genuinely horrifying episodes of the entire war, because the Ottoman army that poured through the breached walls of Nicosia that morning proceeded, across the following hours and by several accounts days, to sack the city with a thoroughness and a brutality that contemporary Venetian and Cypriot survivors described in accounts that, even allowing for the very real tendency of siege survivors on every side of every war this channel has ever told you about to exaggerate the specific horror of what they lived through, agree on a scale of killing that most modern historians place somewhere in the range of 15 to 20,000 dead, soldiers and civilians together, out of a city whose own total population, swollen by refugees who had fled in from the surrounding countryside ahead of the Ottoman advance, may have numbered as many as 50,000 people at the moment the walls finally broke, Surviving accounts describe churches used as killing grounds, the city's own Latin Catholic archbishop killed inside his own cathedral, and a wave of enslavement that swept up thousands of the city's own surviving women and children, sold in the slave markets of Constantinople and across the wider Ottoman world in the weeks and months that followed. A specific and considerable trade in human captives, ordinary families torn apart in a single violent morning and scattered across an empire's own slave markets, that this account is not going to soften, because the same channel that has asked you, on other nights, to sit honestly with the human cost of Christian conquest owes you the same honesty here, regardless of which side of this particular war happened to be doing the conquering, and regardless of how uncomfortable that same honesty sits alongside the considerable celebration. The rest of tonight's own story is still, quite patiently and quite deliberately, building toward. It is hard not to notice, too, the specific fate of Nicosia's own governor, Niccolo Dandolo, a member of one of Venice's own oldest and most distinguished patrician families, who died in the fighting during the city's final assault, and whose own severed head, by several surviving accounts, was displayed by the victorious Ottoman soldiers in a manner that presaged, with grim precision, the considerably more elaborate humiliation Marco Antonio Bragadin would suffer at Famagusta less than a year later. A specific detail worth naming because it shows that whatever specific grievance historians have debated as the trigger for Bragadin's own particular torture, the broader pattern of displaying a defeated Venetian commander's own body as a public trophy was not at Famagusta, some unprecedented departure from the campaign's own established conduct, but a continuation of a pattern the fall of Nicosia had already set the previous autumn. And it is worth remembering too that among the many thousands enslaved in Nicosia's own sack were a considerable number of the city's own noble and merchant families, women and children of real social standing in Venetian colonial society reduced, within the space of a single morning, to captives sold in the same markets that had, for generations, processed captives of every social rank at once, a specific and levelling horror that several surviving Venetian accounts dwell on at particular length, precisely because it violated so completely the assumption, comfortable and almost entirely unexamined until that same morning, that wealth and noble birth might somehow purchase safety even amid a city's own violent fall. Consider, too, a handful of additional details about the 11 months at Famagusta this account has not yet given you, because the siege's own sheer duration reflected an engineering struggle at least as much as it reflected the courage of Bragadin's own defenders, Ottoman engineers digging an extensive network of siege trenches and tunnels toward the city's own walls across months of patient, exhausting labour conducted under near-constant defensive fire, a method of siege warfare that this channel has already shown you, on other nights, defined nearly every protracted fortress siege of this same broad era, and the defenders themselves, reduced by the siege's final weeks to a garrison numbering, as this account has already told you, only a few hundred men still capable of bearing arms, had exhausted not only their own food, but very nearly their own gunpowder as well. A specific and desperate scarcity that several surviving accounts credit as the single deciding factor that finally pushed Bragadin toward the negotiated surrender, whose own betrayal this account has already walked you through in full. It is worth naming too that Bragadin was not the only senior officer to suffer at Lala Mustafa Pasha's own hands in the days following that broken surrender, because two of his own principal subordinates, the Venetian commanders Astore Baglioni and Alvise Martinengo, were executed alongside a considerable number of other captured officers in the same round of killing that claimed Bragadin's own honour guard, a wider massacre of the garrison's surviving command structure that this account names here because Bragadin's own singularly horrifying fate has, across 4.5 centuries of retelling, tended to eclipse entirely the considerably larger number of men who died alongside him in those same terrible days. It is worth remembering, too, what actually happened to the considerably larger number of ordinary soldiers and civilians who survived Famagusta's own fall, because the specific terms Lala Mustafa Pasha broke applied most directly to the garrison's own officers, and a substantial number of the city's own remaining Christian population, several thousand people by most estimates, were in fact enslaved in the days following the surrender, loaded onto Ottoman ships and carried into the same wider Mediterranean slave economy. This account has already described, claiming so many thousands from Nicosia the previous year, a final and considerable human cost layered on top of the 11 months of siege, starvation and bombardment the city had already endured, and one that meant Cyprus's own conquest. Taken as a whole across both major sieges, produced something in the range of 30 to 40,000 Cypriot and Venetian dead and enslaved combined. A toll several careful modern historians have suggested makes the Cyprus campaign, considered purely in terms of civilian and captive suffering, considerably more costly in human terms than the naval battle. This whole account has spent so much of tonight's telling building toward a specific and sobering piece of arithmetic that popular memory, fixed as it tends to be on the drama of a single afternoon's naval combat, has rarely given the weight this account believes it actually deserves. It is hard not to notice, too, exactly how completely the fall of Nicosia reshaped the rest of the Cypriot campaign, because news of the sack, carried by refugees and by Ottoman envoys alike to every remaining Venetian garrison still holding out elsewhere on the island, produced a wave of rapid surrenders across smaller Cypriot towns and fortresses, whose own defenders, having just learned in the most brutal terms imaginable what resistance to the bitter end had cost Nicosia, chose in several documented cases to negotiate terms rather than risk the same fate, a pattern of collapsing resistance that left, within only a few more weeks, a single major Venetian stronghold still holding out anywhere on the island, the eastern port city of Famagusta, whose own defenders, watching this same pattern of rapid Ottoman advance and brutal reprisal unfold across the rest of Cyprus that autumn, made a decision that would produce, across the following 11 months, both one of the most genuinely heroic defensive sieges of the entire 16th century and one of its single most notorious atrocities, 11 months behind a wall that would not break, Famagusta, defended by a garrison that numbered at the siege's own opening in September of 1570, somewhere around 8,000 soldiers under the command of a Venetian nobleman named Marco Antonio Bragadin, held out against an Ottoman besieging force that would eventually grow to well over 100,000 men, reinforced repeatedly across the following year as Lala Mustafa Pasha, increasingly frustrated by a single city's own refusal to fall, poured fresh troops and fresh artillery into a siege that had, by any reasonable strategic accounting, already achieved everything the original campaign had set out to achieve elsewhere on the island. The defenders of Famagusta endured a siege that surviving accounts describe in terms almost identical to the worst sieges this channel has already carried you through on other nights. Starvation that reduced the garrison, by the siege's final months, to eating cats, dogs, and eventually the leather of their own equipment, a bombardment that Ottoman artillery maintained for months on end, reportedly firing well over 100,000 cannonballs into the city's own walls across the full length of the siege, a rate of sustained bombardment that few fortified cities anywhere in 16th century Europe had ever been asked to absorb, and disease that spread through a garrison and civilian population packed together behind walls that offered no real space for the sick to be separated from the well. By the summer of 1571, Bragadin's garrison had been reduced, through combat losses, disease, and starvation combined, to perhaps a few hundred men still capable of bearing arms, a fraction so small that continued resistance had become, in the most literal military sense, no longer genuinely possible, and Bragadin, faced with a choice between a final hopeless assault that would end in the same kind of massacre Nicosia had already suffered, or a negotiated surrender that might spare what remained of the city's own population, open terms with Lala Mustafa Pasha in late July of that year. The terms the two commanders agreed to, and it is worth naming plainly how genuinely generous these terms actually were by the standards of siege warfare this channel has walked you through on a dozen other nights, promised the surviving garrison safe passage off the island, free transport for any civilians who wish to leave, and the preservation of the city's own churches and its own Christian population's freedom of worship. Terms that Bragadin, by every surviving account, negotiated in good faith, and that Lala Mustafa Pasha, at least in the initial agreement the two men actually signed, appears to have offered in equally good faith. What happened next has been debated, argued over, and in certain particulars genuinely disputed by historians on both sides of this same conflict for 4.5 centuries, but the broad outline, confirmed by multiple independent Venetian, Ottoman and third-party European accounts, written in the immediate aftermath, is not seriously in question. When Bragadin arrived at Lala Mustafa Pasha's own camp on the 5th of August to formally conclude the surrender, accompanied by a small honour guard of his own remaining officers, the Ottoman commander's mood, for reasons contemporary accounts attribute variously to the discovery that several Ottoman prisoners held inside Famagusta had reportedly been killed during the siege's final chaotic days, to simple fury at the staggering cost 11 months of resistance had exacted from his own army, or to some combination of both, turned suddenly and violently against the very terms he had just signed. Bragadin's own officers were killed on the spot, and Bragadin himself was subjected across the following 2 weeks to a sequence of deliberate and escalating humiliation and torture that contemporary accounts describe in genuinely difficult detail. An ear and then his own nose cut off, forced marches around the city's own walls under a hail of mockery from the assembled Ottoman soldiers, and finally, on the 17th of August, 1571, execution by flaying, the removal of his own skin while he was still alive, a death several surviving eyewitness accounts describe him enduring with a composure that even several of his own executioners reportedly found remarkable. It is worth naming, honestly, exactly what happened to Bragadin's remains after his own death, because the specific fate of his skin became, in the years and centuries that followed, one of the most enduring and most bitterly remembered symbols of the entire war, stuffed with straw, dressed in Bragadin's own uniform, and paraded through the streets of Famagusta, and later, by several accounts, displayed as a trophy carried aboard Ottoman ships, before eventually making its way to Constantinople, where it remained for years afterward, until a Venetian naval officer, in an act of considerable daring recorded across several later accounts, is said to have recovered the relic decades later and returned it to Venice, where it was interred, with considerable ceremony, in the church of Santi Giovanni e Paolo, and where a monument to Bragadin, his own remains sealed within it, still stands today, a physical and continuous thread running from a Cypriot fortress wall in 1571 to a Venetian church that a visitor can walk into this same week. It is worth remembering too, and this account owes you the honesty of naming it plainly rather than letting a single atrocity stand in for an entire war. That Ottoman treatment of the defeated across this same Cyprus campaign was not uniform, that several Venetian garrisons elsewhere on the island who surrendered on terms had those terms honoured in full, and that Lala Mustafa Pasha's own conduct at Famagusta, whatever specific grievance triggered it, was condemned by a number of contemporary Ottoman as well as Christian observers as a genuine breach of the accepted customs of war both sides otherwise generally respected. A breach whose own shock waves, reaching Venice within weeks, and the rest of Christian Europe not long after, would do more than any single Ottoman military victory to finally push a fractured, mutually suspicious coalition of Christian powers toward the fleet. This account has been promising you, across the whole of tonight's telling so far, a league stitched together out of mutual suspicion. Pope Pius V, elected to the papacy in 1566, had spent nearly the whole of his own reign as pontiff pursuing, with a religious intensity that several of his own diplomats found genuinely difficult to work around, a single grand ambition: the assembly of a unified Christian coalition capable of confronting Ottoman naval power directly, a project he had begun pursuing even before Selim's own invasion of Cyprus gave that same ambition a specific and urgent justification, and it was Pius, more than any single monarch or Venetian senator, who actually drove the diplomatic negotiations that would eventually produce what came to be called the Holy League into existence. The negotiations themselves, conducted across nearly a full year between Rome, Venice and Madrid, reveal, in nearly every surviving diplomatic dispatch from the period, exactly how little genuine trust existed between the powers Pius was attempting to unite, because Venice, having already lost Nicosia and watching Famagusta besieged even as these same negotiations dragged on, wanted an alliance focused narrowly and immediately on relieving Cyprus, while Philip II of Spain, whose own fleet and treasury would need to supply the overwhelming bulk of any combined force, wanted commitments considerably broader in scope and duration, a coalition that could also address Ottoman allied corsair activity along Spain's own North African and Mediterranean coastline. Concerns Venice, eager above all to move quickly, regarded as a genuine but distinctly secondary priority next to the immediate crisis unfolding on Cyprus. It is worth remembering plainly exactly how deep the underlying distrust between Spain and Venice actually ran, because the two powers had spent much of the preceding century as commercial and occasionally military rivals across the Mediterranean, and Philip's own advisors harboured real and repeatedly voiced suspicion that Venice, true to the pattern this account has already described, of negotiating a separate peace with Constantinople whenever a war grew sufficiently costly, might abandon any coalition the moment a settlement favourable to Venetian trading interests presented itself, a suspicion that would prove, as this account is going to show you before tonight is through, considerably more prescient than anyone negotiating the treaty in the spring of 1571 could have comfortably admitted at the time. Philip, for his own part, brought to these same negotiations a genuine and deeply held Catholic religious commitment to the anti-Ottoman cause, but also a set of competing strategic priorities that never fully disappeared from his own calculations, even at the height of the crisis. An ongoing and expensive struggle to suppress rebellion in the Low Countries that this channel has already told you about in full on another night. A continued and costly military presence required to guard Spain's own long North African coastline against corsair raids, and a treasury that, however vast the silver flowing in from Spain's American possessions, was never quite as inexhaustible as European rivals sometimes imagined it to be. Despite these same considerable frictions, Pius V's persistence, combined with the genuine shock the reports from Famagusta sent through Catholic Europe once Bragadin's own fate became widely known, finally produced a formal treaty, signed in Rome on the 25th of May, 1571, establishing the Holy League as a formal military alliance between the Papal States, Spain and Venice, joined by smaller contingents from Genoa, the Duchy of Savoy, the Duchy of Urbino, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, and the Knights of Malta, an alliance whose own founding treaty committed its members to maintaining a combined fleet of some 200 galleys, 100 support ships, and 50,000 soldiers to be assembled and deployed each spring for as long as the war against the Ottoman Empire continued, funded through a specific and carefully negotiated formula, splitting costs roughly in proportion to each power's own stake in the outcome, Spain and its own Italian possessions bearing the largest single share, Venice the second largest, and the Papacy the remainder. It is worth pausing briefly on exactly whose labour and whose taxation actually paid for this same enormous undertaking, because a fleet of this size, assembled and provisioned for months at a stretch, represented a staggering financial burden that did not, in the end, fall on the kings and the doges and the popes, who get their own names remembered in accounts like this one, but on the ordinary taxpayers, tenant farmers, and not least, the enslaved and forcibly conscripted mining labourers of Spain's own American possessions, whose own extracted silver, shipped across the Atlantic in the very galleons this account has already told you were beginning to reshape naval warfare elsewhere in the world, financed a very considerable share of Philip's own contribution to the League's combined treasury, a specific and often overlooked thread connecting a mine in the Andes to a gun deck in the Gulf of Patras, that this channel, having already told you in full on another night about the human cost of that same silver's extraction, is not going to let pass unremarked here. Pope Pius V, for his own part, raised a considerable portion of the papacy's own contribution through a specific ecclesiastical tax levied on church revenues across Catholic Europe, a crusading tithe of exactly the kind this channel has already shown you funded the crusades of earlier centuries, a reminder that the financial machinery underwriting a holy war against the Ottoman Empire in 1571 drew on institutional habits the Catholic Church had already been refining for the better part of 500 years by that point. The bastard prince given command of everything. The single most consequential decision the League's own leadership made that same summer, after the treaty itself was signed, was the appointment of a supreme commander for the combined fleet, a decision that fell in the end to Philip II of Spain, whose own contribution of ships and men gave him the greatest practical claim to naming the man who would lead them, and Philip's choice, when it finally came, surprised a good many observers across Europe. His own illegitimate half-brother, a 24-year-old man named Juan, known to history as Don John of Austria. Don Juan had been born in Regensburg in 1547, the secret son of Philip's own father, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and a German noblewoman named Barbara Blomberg, a liaison Charles had never publicly acknowledged during his own lifetime, but had arranged before his own death to have his illegitimate son raised quietly and well within the Spanish royal household, and Philip, upon learning the full truth of his own father's secret after Charles's death in 1558, had chosen, in a decision that speaks to a genuine and by most accounts real personal affection between the two half-brothers, to formally acknowledge Don Juan, raise him within the highest circles of the Spanish court, and groom him, across the following decade, for exactly the kind of prominent military command that would eventually bring him to a Greek Gulf in the autumn of 1571. By the time Philip named him Supreme Commander of the Holy League's combined fleet in the summer of 1571, Don Juan had already earned a genuine and hard-won military reputation of his own, having led Spanish forces with real distinction in the recent and brutal suppression of a Morisco rebellion in the mountains of southern Spain, a campaign whose own considerable human cost this channel is not going to soften, even in the midst of introducing you to the same commander. This story is going to ask you to admire in the chapters ahead, because a fair accounting of any historical figure this channel brings you owes you both halves of that figure's own record. Don Juan had also, by the same point in his own young career, already commanded Spanish naval squadrons against Barbary corsair strongholds along the North African coast, a specific and directly relevant apprenticeship in exactly the kind of Mediterranean naval warfare the Holy League's own combined fleet would soon require of him, giving Philip's own choice, whatever the grumbling it provoked among more senior commanders, a genuine foundation in prior command experience that a less charitable telling of this same appointment sometimes leaves out entirely. It is worth naming, too, exactly how unusual it was, by the rigid protocols of 16th century European aristocratic command, to hand supreme authority over so vast and so expensive a combined fleet to a 24-year-old man whose own royal blood ran only through an unacknowledged, and, for most of his own childhood, entirely secret line. A choice that provoked real and audible grumbling among several of the League's own more senior and more experienced commanders, chief among them the Genoese Admiral Gianandrea Doria, whose own family had commanded galley fleets in Spanish service for generations, and who regarded the young Don Juan's appointment, whatever genuine personal charm and battlefield courage the young commander possessed, as a decision made more for its political symbolism, a Habsburg prince, however illegitimate, standing visibly at the head of a Christian crusade, than for any proven command experience actually commanding a fleet of this size in open naval battle. Two very different systems, each building an army out of boys who had no say in the matter. It is worth pausing, before this account carries you to Messina, on exactly how differently the two empires about to collide in this same war actually built the soldiers who would do their fighting for them, because the contrast reveals a great deal about how each state actually understood its own relationship to the men whose lives it was about to spend. The Ottoman military system this account has already introduced you to through Sokolu Mehmed Pasha's own career rested on two interlocking institutions: the Devshirme levy that funneled talented Christian boys toward administrative and janissary careers, and the Timar system, a form of military land grant under which Ottoman cavalrymen, the Sipahis, held the right to collect revenue from an assigned parcel of agricultural land in exchange for reporting for military service, fully equipped and mounted at their own expense, whenever the Sultan called them, a system that let the empire field very large armies without maintaining anything resembling the kind of continuous cash payroll a fully professional standing army would require, at the cost of a fighting force whose own individual soldiers varied enormously in training, equipment, and loyalty, depending on how conscientiously any given provincial governor had actually maintained his own district's military obligations. Spain, by contrast, had spent the 16th century building something closer to Europe's first genuinely professional standing infantry. The tercio system this account has already mentioned to you, regiments of several thousand men each, recruited through a mixture of genuine volunteer enlistment, promising pay, plunder, and the specific social prestige Spanish culture attached to military service against the Ottomans and at various points across this same century against Protestant rebels in the Low Countries, alongside a considerable admixture of foreign mercenary companies, German and Italian units hired on fixed-term contract, a system that produced, by most military historians' own assessment, a considerably more consistently trained and consistently equipped fighting force than the Ottoman provincial levy system typically managed, but that came with its own specific and chronic weakness, an army whose own loyalty depended, in the most literal and immediate sense, on whether the Spanish crown's own famously overextended treasury actually managed to pay it on time, a failure that would produce, only 5 years after this story's own battle, the very Spanish fury this channel has already told you about on another night, unpaid Spanish troops sacking the city of Antwerp, not as an act of war against any enemy, but as a desperate and violent response to months of unpaid wages. A specific and telling reminder that the same soldiers who fought with such genuine courage at Lepanto were, in the ordinary course of their own working lives, men whose own crown treated their own pay considerably less reliably than it treated the glory it was happy to claim on their behalf. Gathering at Messina, a fleet built from mutual suspicion, the Holy League's combined fleet assembled across the late summer of 1571 at the Sicilian port of Messina, and it is worth pausing here on the sheer logistical scale of what that same assembly actually required, because bringing together contingents from half a dozen separate Italian and Iberian powers, each maintaining its own separate chain of command, its own separate pay structure, its own separate provisioning arrangements, and its own separate and often genuinely prickly sense of national and civic pride, into anything resembling a single coordinated fighting force was, in the plainest and most practical sense, one of the most difficult diplomatic and administrative achievements of the entire campaign, arguably more difficult in certain specific respects than the battle that would eventually follow it. Simply feeding and watering a force of this size presented its own considerable challenge quite apart from the diplomatic frictions this account is about to describe, because a combined fleet and army numbering somewhere close to 80,000 men gathered in a single port city for weeks on end required a continuous supply of fresh water, bread and salted provisions, on a scale that strained Messina's own considerable resources and that of the surrounding Sicilian countryside considerably further, Spanish and Italian officials scrambling across the summer of 1571 to requisition grain and livestock from across the island, and it was this same crowded, close-quartered assembly of tens of thousands of men drawn from a dozen different regions and living for weeks in conditions no 16th century port city's own sanitation could adequately handle. That produced, as it very nearly always did whenever armies of this size gathered anywhere in this same century, a real and documented outbreak of disease, dysentery and fever spreading through the assembled camps and claiming, by several accounts, a meaningful number of lives before the fleet ever engaged a single Ottoman ship. A specific and largely unrecorded toll this account names here because it belongs, honestly, alongside every other category of death this whole night has already asked you to count, and because the same fever that very nearly kept Cervantes from his own post aboard the Marquesa was, in all likelihood, simply one specific case among a great many others moving through that same crowded waiting fleet in the weeks before the battle finally came. Venetian Spanish sailors, by multiple contemporary accounts, very nearly came to blows on more than one occasion during the weeks the fleet spent assembling and provisioning at Messina. Old commercial rivalries and newer wartime frictions, including a genuinely serious dispute over whether Venetian oarsmen, many of them free citizens serving under contract rather than enslaved or convict labour, should be armed and permitted to fight alongside the soldiers aboard their own ships, a Venetian practice that differed sharply from the Spanish preference for keeping oarsmen unarmed and strictly separated from combat duties, surfacing repeatedly and requiring real and continuous diplomatic effort from Don Juan and his own senior commanders simply to hold the assembled coalition together long enough to actually put to sea. Consider, too, exactly who actually filled the fighting decks of this same assembled fleet, because the soldiers gathering at Messina that summer were drawn from very nearly every corner of Catholic Europe at once. Veteran Spanish infantry, the famous tercio regiments whose own disciplined pike and shot formations had already made them the single most feared infantry in continental Europe on land, redeployed here to fight from shipboard rather than from open field, alongside Italian militia levies raised by Venice, the Papacy, and half a dozen smaller Italian states, German and Swiss mercenary companies hired for the campaign on short-term contract, and a considerable and genuinely striking number of young noblemen from across Europe who held no formal command and drew no soldier's wage at all. Volunteers who paid their own way to Messina and back specifically for the chance to fight in what a great many of them, raised on the same chivalric and crusading literature that had shaped European aristocratic culture for centuries, understood as the single greatest opportunity of their own generation to win the kind of battlefield glory their grandfathers had won at Rhodes, or their great-grandfathers had won on the crusading battlefields this channel has already carried you across on other nights. A motive that reads, from this distance, as almost quaintly old-fashioned, and that nonetheless filled a meaningful number of berths aboard the Christian fleet, with men who had, in the most literal sense, volunteered themselves into one of the bloodiest afternoons of the entire century, purely for the honour of having been there. Consider, for a moment, exactly what kind of ship these men were actually preparing to fight in, because the war galley that dominated Mediterranean naval combat in 1571 was, by this point in its own long history, already something of an anachronism, a design that had changed comparatively little across 2,000 years of Mediterranean seafaring. A long, narrow, shallow-drafted vessel propelled primarily by banks of oars rather than sail, built for speed and manoeuvrability in the relatively calm and enclosed waters of the Mediterranean, rather than for the open ocean endurance the great sailing warships of the Atlantic powers were already beginning to favour. A typical war galley of this period carried somewhere between 20 and 30 oars to a side, each oar pulled by 3, 4 or occasionally 5 men seated together on a single rowing bench, a crew of rowers that could run, on the largest galleys involved in this same campaign, well over 200 men on a single vessel, alongside a smaller complement of sailors handling the ship's own auxiliary sail, and a company of soldiers, ranging from a few dozen to well over 100 depending on the ship's own size and role, who fought from the vessel's own raised bow platform and along its own decks once 2 galleys closed for boarding, because naval combat between galleys in this period remained, at its core, remarkably close to land combat conducted on a floating platform, ships manoeuvring to ram or grapple an enemy vessel, and then fighting the actual decisive engagement hand to hand, across locked or nearly touching decks, it is worth remembering, plainly and without softening it, exactly who actually rowed these same ships, because the answer differed meaningfully between the two fleets about to meet in battle, and reveals, in its own quiet way, one of the genuinely uncomfortable truths sitting underneath this entire war's grand religious framing. The Ottoman fleet's oar benches were crewed overwhelmingly by enslaved Christian captives, men taken in raids along the coast this account has already described, purchased in the slave markets of Constantinople and Algiers, or condemned to the oar as a specific legal punishment, chained to their own benches for months or years at a stretch, fed just enough to keep them capable of pulling an oar and flogged by the near-universal testimony of surviving accounts from men who lived through it, whenever a ship's own officers judged the rowing pace insufficient. The Christian fleet's own oar benches, meanwhile, were crewed through a considerably more varied mixture that included free wage-earning oarsmen, particularly aboard Venetian vessels, whose own galleys had a long tradition of employing free citizen rowers who could, when the moment demanded it, be armed and fight alongside the soldiers they rowed into battle, but also, and this account is not going to let the coalition fighting under a papal banner escape the same honest accounting it has just given the Ottoman fleet, a very considerable number of enslaved and convict rowers of its own, Muslim captives taken in earlier raids and naval engagements, criminals sentenced to the oar by Spanish and Italian courts as an alternative to execution or imprisonment, chained to Christian benches in conditions that surviving accounts describe as differing from their counterparts aboard Ottoman ships, mainly in the religion of the men doing the chaining rather than in any meaningful difference in the chains themselves. It is worth naming, too, the specific and genuinely wrenching tactical dilemma this same reality created for both fleets once the battle this account is building toward actually began, because a galley that lost its own oar power in the middle of a naval engagement became, in the most literal sense, a helpless target, unable to manoeuvre, unable to retreat, entirely at the mercy of whatever enemy vessel closed with it next, and both fleets facing the very real prospect of defeat confronted a choice this account owes you honestly rather than glossing past. Whether to unchain their own enslaved oarsmen in the battle's final desperate hours, arming men who had spent months or years in chains and offering them freedom in exchange for fighting, alongside the very captors who had enslaved them. A choice that several Christian commanders, including aboard at least one of the Venetian galleys this account will return to before tonight's story of the battle itself is finished, made in the heat of the fighting, and a choice that produced on more than one deck that October afternoon the genuinely strange spectacle of men who had been rowing in chains an hour earlier fighting, weapons in hand for whichever side had just cut those same chains, not necessarily out of any loyalty newly discovered, but out of the plainest possible calculation that a ship still afloat, whoever commanded it, offered better odds of survival than a ship about to sink with its own oarsmen still shackled to the benches. It is worth pausing briefly on the specific ceremony that sent this same fleet out of Messina harbour, because Pius V's own papal legate presided, in the days immediately before departure, over a formal blessing of the assembled ships and soldiers, and presented Don Juan personally, on the Pope's own behalf, with a ceremonial sword and a commander's baton specifically consecrated for the occasion, gifts intended to mark the coming campaign, in the most explicit and deliberate terms the papacy could offer, as a holy undertaking blessed directly by Christ's own vicar on earth, rather than merely another secular war among rival Mediterranean powers, a piece of religious theatre that mattered enormously to how a great many of the ordinary soldiers aboard that fleet actually understood the fight they were about to enter. Whatever more mundane calculations of trade routes and tax revenue had actually driven the diplomats who assembled the coalition in the first place. Banners specifically consecrated for the campaign flew from a considerable number of the fleet's own ships, including, aboard Don Juan's own flagship, a banner bearing an image of the crucified Christ that the real carried into the battle itself, a specific and physical thread connecting the fleet's own official religious framing to the actual violence its soldiers were about to commit, and one that several surviving accounts describe individual soldiers turning to look toward in the battle's own most desperate moments, for whatever comfort a length of consecrated cloth could actually offer a man about to die. It is hard not to notice, too, exactly how differently the two empires actually explained this same coming war to their own populations, because Ottoman chroniclers writing in Constantinople framed the Cyprus campaign, consistently and almost without exception, as a just and religiously sanctioned recovery of land properly belonging to Islamic rule, emphasizing the legal fatwa this account has already told you about, and largely omitting or minimizing the specific atrocities its own soldiers committed at Nicosia and Famagusta. While Christian preachers and pamphleteers across Catholic Europe frame the same war in an almost perfectly mirrored register, a righteous defence of Christendom against an aggressive and inherently expansionist infidel power, dwelling at length and in genuinely lurid detail on Bragadin's own fate, while showing considerably less interest in examining the conduct of their own soldiers once victory was actually achieved, a specific and symmetrical propaganda pattern that should, by this point in tonight's own telling, feel entirely familiar, because it is the same pattern this channel has shown you, shaping how nearly every war in nearly every century it has ever covered gets explained to the ordinary people asked to fight and to pay for it. The fleet that finally departed Messina on the 16th of September, 1571, numbered, by the most careful modern accounting historians, have been able to reconstruct from surviving muster records on both the Christian and Ottoman sides, something in the range of 206 galleys and 6 considerably larger vessels called galleasses, a Venetian innovation this account will return to in detail once the actual battle begins, carrying altogether somewhere between 75 and 84,000 men, of whom roughly 20,000 were soldiers, and the remainder oarsmen, sailors and support crew, arrayed against an Ottoman fleet that Ottoman and Christian intelligence both estimated at somewhere between 250 and 280 vessels, carrying, by similarly careful modern estimates, somewhere in the range of 88,000 men total, a rough numerical parity between the two fleets that masked, as this account is about to show you, some genuinely significant differences in the quality and the specific composition of each side's own fighting strength. A council of war, and a young commander who chose to fight. The League's fleet spent the following weeks working its way slowly eastward along the Italian coast, gathering final reinforcements at various ports, including the small but genuinely welcome contingent of galleys the Knights of Malta had sent. The same order this account has already told you had bled so heavily, defending their own island against Suleiman 6 years earlier, and it was only in the first days of October, after the fleet had reached the Ionian island of Corfu, that reliable intelligence finally reached Don Juan's own war council, confirming that the Ottoman fleet, having spent the summer raiding along the Adriatic and Ionian coastlines, with the same freedom of movement this account has already described the Ottoman navy enjoying for most of the preceding half-century, had withdrawn into a sheltered anchorage at the entrance to the Gulf of Patras, near a small fortified town the Venetians called Lepanto, to wait out the remainder of the campaigning season in comparative safety. The War Council Don Juan convened aboard his own flagship to decide what to do with this same intelligence produced by nearly every surviving account of the meeting, a genuinely sharp and consequential division of opinion among his own senior commanders. Gianandrea Doria, whose own earlier misgivings about the young commander's appointment this account has already described to you, argued forcefully for caution, pointing to the lateness of the season, the very real risk that a fleet this large and this logistically fragile faced from autumn storms in open water, and the considerable danger of committing the entire hard-won coalition fleet to a single decisive engagement against an enemy holding the advantage of a defensible anchorage, an argument several other experienced commanders found genuinely persuasive, given how difficult this same coalition had already proven to assemble, and how catastrophic its loss would be for the whole anti-Ottoman cause the League had been built to serve. The Venetian commanders present, chief among them the Republic's own ageing but famously combative Captain General Sebastiano Venier, argued with equal and considerably more visible force for immediate battle, a position that reflected both genuine military calculation. An Ottoman fleet caught at anchor and unprepared might be destroyed with considerably less risk than one allowed to regroup and choose its own moment to strike, and the plainer, raw fact that Venice had already lost Cyprus, had already lost Nicosia and Famagusta, and Bragadin's own skin to Ottoman hands, and was in no mood whatsoever to see this same fleet withdraw for the winter without giving the Ottoman navy the fight it had been assembled, at enormous cost and enormous diplomatic effort, specifically to give. Don Juan, weighing these two positions in a debate that surviving accounts describe stretching across several tense hours, chose, in the end, to fight, a decision several modern historians have read as reflecting both the young commander's own genuine personal temperament, a man who had, across his short career already, shown a consistent preference for decisive action over cautious delay, and a shrewder political calculation that a coalition assembled with such difficulty and funded at such expense could not realistically be brought home for the winter, having accomplished nothing more than an autumn cruise along the Greek coastline, a political reality that would have made the entire Holy League and Don Juan's own command of it look considerably foolish regardless of whatever sound tactical reasoning Doria's own caution actually rested on. The fleet weighed anchor and moved to intercept the Ottoman force on the 5th of October, and by the evening of the 6th, scouting vessels from both fleets had sighted one another across the waters approaching the Gulf of Patras, confirming to commanders on both sides that the battle each fleet had spent the entire campaigning season either seeking or avoiding was now, with the sunrise only hours away, no longer avoidable at all. Picture, for a moment, before this account carries you into the tactics and the timeline of the battle itself, exactly what that single morning would have pressed against the senses of the 140,000 men crowded into that narrow gulf, because the history books that record troop counts and division commanders rarely pause long enough to tell you what a battle like this one actually felt like from inside it. The sound alone would have been almost unbearable to a modern ear. The deep rhythmic beat of drums aboard nearly every galley on both sides, keeping time for rowers whose own survival depended on pulling in exact unbroken unison, layered under the creak and groan of hundreds of wooden hulls, working against one another in close water, under trumpets and horns sounding signals between ships too far apart for any human voice to carry, and under the war cries, the shouted prayers, and, once the fighting actually joined, the screaming of tens of thousands of men in close and desperate combat, a wall of noise that several surviving accounts describe as having been audible, in its opening barrages at least, from the shore of the Gulf itself, miles from the actual fighting. The smell would have been just as overwhelming in its own way, the thick sulphurous smoke of cannon and small arms fire settling low over water, calm enough to trap it, mixing with the ordinary and considerable stench of thousands of men who had already spent weeks aboard cramped, sweltering galleys, and, as the day wore on, the specific and unmistakable smell of blood in genuinely staggering quantity, because a battle that killed something in the range of 30,000 men across a single afternoon left a gulf whose own water, by multiple eyewitness accounts, had visibly reddened in patches by the time the fighting finally ended. Consider, too, the specific and genuinely strange sight the Gulf itself must have presented by the battle's final hour. Hundreds of ships locked together in tangled, grinding clusters, rather than moving freely across open water, oars broken and trailing uselessly from hulls that could no longer manoeuvre, sails torn and burning on ships too crowded with wreckage, and with the dead and the dying to be sailed away even by crews still capable of the work, and, scattered across the whole of that same crowded water, thousands of individual men, wounded, drowning, or simply thrown from decks too chaotic to hold them, struggling in water that offered, for a great many of them, no rescue from either side. A modern viewer, shown a single frame of that afternoon without any context at all, might struggle to recognise it as a naval battle in any sense a later century would come to understand that word, because Lepanto, in its final hours especially, more closely resembled a single vast and terrible collision, a slow-motion pile-up of hundreds of ships fused together by grappling hooks and by the simple physical crush of too many hulls occupying too little water at once, than it resembled the graceful, manoeuvring fleet actions that sailing warships would come to fight in the centuries that followed it. A morning that opened with almost no wind at all. The 7th of October, 1571, broke calm over the Gulf of Patras, a stillness in the air that mattered enormously to the battle about to unfold, because a galley fleet, built as it was for exactly this kind of enclosed, wind-sheltered water, could fight at its own full effectiveness only in conditions like these, and both commanders, waking to a sea flat enough that oar power alone would decide nearly everything that followed, understood immediately that nothing about the weather itself was going to hand either side an excuse to delay. Don Juan, aboard his own flagship, the Real, spent the early hours of that same morning arranging his own combined fleet into a formation that reflected weeks of careful planning. Among his own senior commanders, 3 main divisions stretched across a battle line several miles wide, the right wing under Gianandrea Doria's own command positioned to guard against any Ottoman attempt to outflank the Christian line along the open southern water, the left wing under the Venetian commander Agostino Barbarigo positioned close against the shallower northern coastline to deny the Ottoman fleet any similar room to manoeuvre around that same flank, and the centre, the largest and most heavily reinforced division, under Don Juan's own direct command, flanked by the Venetian Captain-General Sebastiano Venier on one side and the Papal commander Marcantonio Colonna on the other. A formation deliberately built to funnel the coming engagement into the kind of close, grinding ship-to-ship melee that Christian numbers in soldiers and in shipboard firepower, rather than any advantage in raw ship count, were expected to decide. Don Juan held back too, a 4th and smaller reserve division, positioned behind the main line under the command of the veteran Spanish Admiral Alvaro de Bazan, Marquis of Santa Cruz, a commander whose own considerable naval reputation would, within the following 2 decades, make him Spain's own first choice to plan and lead the ill-fated Armada against England, a campaign this channel may tell you the full story of on another night, and it was this same reserve squadron, held deliberately out of the opening engagement specifically so that it could be committed wherever the Christian line actually buckled first. That would prove decisive in more than one of the crises this account is about to walk you through, plugging the gap left by Barbarigo's own collapsing northern flank at the battle's most dangerous early hour and reinforcing the centre once the fighting around Ali Pasha's own flagship reached its own most desperate pitch. It is worth pausing here on the 6 unusual vessels Don Juan positioned well ahead of his own main battle line, because the Venetian galleasses, towering, heavily built merchant galley hybrids mounting considerably more cannon than any conventional war galley could carry, represented a genuinely new and, as this account will show you within the hour, genuinely decisive innovation in Mediterranean naval warfare. Ships so much larger and so much slower than the oar-powered galleys around them, that towing them into position ahead of the main fleet had taken Venetian crews the better part of the preceding night. But ships that Don Juan's own war council had gambled, correctly as events would soon prove, could shatter the tight Ottoman formation with concentrated cannon fire before the 2 main battle lines ever closed to boarding range. A single tactical decision that several modern naval historians have credited with doing more to determine the battle's eventual outcome than any other single choice made on either side that morning. It is worth naming plainly exactly what made these 6 ships so unusual, because a galleass was, at its origin, a converted merchant vessel, a broader, deeper-hulled design originally built for cargo rather than for war, refitted by Venetian naval engineers with reinforced gun decks capable of mounting artillery along both sides of the hull, in addition to the bow-mounted guns a conventional war galley typically carried, giving each galleass a weight of broadside fire that several contemporary estimates place at 5 to 10 times what an ordinary galley of the period could bring to bear, at the cost of a hull so much heavier and so much less manoeuvrable under oar power alone that a galleass could not realistically be rowed into position under its own power in the way a conventional galley could, requiring, as this account has already told you, the better part of an entire night's labour from smaller galleys, towing each vessel into its own assigned position ahead of the main battle line. Ottoman commanders, sighting these same 6 vessels positioned unusually far ahead of the Christian formation, as their own fleet approached that morning, appear, by several accounts, to have mistaken them at first for slow, disabled merchant ships that had simply fallen out of position. A misjudgment that cost the Ottoman fleet dearly once those same ships opened fire at close range with a weight of shot no galley captain in the entire Ottoman navy had ever personally experienced. It is worth pausing too on the specific and lasting controversy surrounding Gianandrea Doria's own conduct this account has already described to you, because a considerable body of later historical writing, produced across the following 4 centuries by historians working in both the Venetian and the wider Italian tradition, has judged Doria considerably more harshly than this account's own earlier, comparatively measured description of his caution might suggest, several accusing him outright of deliberately holding his own family's considerable private fleet back from the worst of the fighting in order to preserve ships that represented, in very concrete financial terms, a substantial portion of his own family's private wealth, an accusation Doria's own modern defenders have pushed back against, by pointing out that his own division did, in fact, engage Uluç Ali's forces directly for a considerable portion of the battle, and that the gap Uluç Ali exploited may reflect a genuine and defensible tactical judgment about the risk of encirclement rather than any deliberate cowardice. An argument this account cannot fully resolve for you tonight, because the surviving evidence, drawn overwhelmingly from accounts written by men who had their own reasons, favourable or unfavourable, to shape how Doria's own conduct that day would be remembered, simply does not permit a fully confident verdict either way. A genuine and honest historical uncertainty this account would rather name plainly than paper over with false confidence in either direction. The Ottoman fleet, sighted advancing from the western end of the Gulf, under a full spread of sail and oar alike, arranged itself in a mirroring 3-division formation under the overall command of Muezzinzadeh Ali Pasha, the Ottoman Navy's own Capudan Pasha, a commander whose own considerable naval experience was matched by real personal courage, but whose own force, this account has to note honestly before the battle itself begins, carried a genuine and consequential structural weakness. The Christian fleet did not share to nearly the same degree, because a substantial share of the Ottoman fleet's own soldiers, drawn from garrison and provincial levies, rather than from the Empire's own most elite standing units. Many of the Empire's most experienced Janissary regiments, having been committed elsewhere or simply unavailable on such short notice, were armed predominantly with composite bows rather than the firearms that had, by 1571, become standard equipment among the Spanish and Italian infantry filling the Christian fleet's own decks, a difference in armament that would matter enormously once the fighting actually closed at point-blank range. Ali Pasha's own right wing was commanded by an experienced Egyptian governor named Mohammed Sirocco, positioned to face Barbarigo's Venetians along the shallow northern coastline, while the Ottoman left wing fell to Uluç Ali, an Italian-born convert to Islam, originally a Calabrian fisherman's son named Giovanni Dionigi Gallini, before his own capture, conversion, and rise through Ottoman naval service to become Beylerbey, governor of Ottoman Algiers, a corsair admiral whose own reputation for tactical cunning was, by 1571, second to none in the entire Ottoman fleet, and whose own division was positioned directly opposite Doria's Genoese squadron on the battle's southern flank. The 2 fleets closed across the late morning hours, and it is worth naming, honestly, exactly what the men aboard both fleets actually experienced in the last quiet minutes before the fighting began, because surviving accounts from soldiers on both sides describe a genuinely strange and unsettling calm, settling over decks about to become killing grounds, priests moving among the Christian ships offering last absolution to soldiers who understood, with real and sober clarity, how unlikely any individual man's own survival actually was, and imams performing similar final rites aboard the Ottoman vessels, both fleets, whatever their own theological disagreements, sharing in that same final hour an almost identical human experience of men praying in their own separate languages, and to what each genuinely believed was the one true God, for courage and for mercy before the killing began. Don Juan himself, by several accounts, had himself rowed in a small skiff along the length of his own entire battle line in the final hour before contact, standing visibly at the bow so that every soldier and every free oarsman aboard every ship could see their own supreme commander with his own sword drawn, a piece of deliberate theatre that several eyewitness accounts credit with meaningfully raising the morale of a fleet that included, among its own ranks, a great many men who had genuine and well-founded reason to doubt their own chances against a fleet whose reputation for invincibility had, until this single morning, gone essentially untested by any Christian coalition of comparable size. It is worth remembering, too, roughly, how these same 206 Christian galleys and 250 to 280 Ottoman vessels actually distributed themselves across the 4 divisions this account has already introduced you to, because the numbers, rounded as the surviving and often conflicting muster records force any honest modern account to round them, show a battle that was considerably more evenly matched division by division than the aggregate totals alone might suggest. Barbashko's northern squadron of roughly 55 galleys facing a slightly larger Ottoman force of some 60 vessels under Sirocco, Don Juan's own reinforced centre of some 62 galleys facing Ali Pasha's own, roughly similar-sized command at the Sultana, Doria's southern wing of about 55 ships facing a considerably larger Ottoman left of over 90 vessels under Uluç Ali, an imbalance on that specific flank that goes some real way toward explaining both why Uluç Ali found the fighting there so favourable, and why Doria's own caution, whatever its true motive, was not entirely without a genuine tactical basis, and Santa Cruz's own reserve of roughly 30 ships held back, as this account has already told you, to be committed wherever the fighting actually demanded it most. The galleasses opened the battle, and the Ottoman centre began to bleed before the lines ever closed. The first cannon fire of the battle came, as Don Juan's own war council had planned, from the 6 Venetian galleasses positioned well ahead of the main Christian line, whose own heavy guns, firing into the advancing Ottoman formation from a range and with a weight of shot no conventional war galley could match, tore through several Ottoman vessels before those same vessels had come anywhere close enough to return the favour, sinking, by several accounts, at least 2 Ottoman galleys outright in the battle's opening minutes and inflicting damage on a number of others that would leave them meaningfully weakened for the close engagement still to come. A bombardment that several modern historians credit with disrupting the tight, disciplined Ottoman formation before it ever reached the Christian main line, forcing individual Ottoman captains to manoeuvre around the wreckage and the unexpected gunfire in ways that opened gaps in a formation that had been, only minutes earlier, advancing in close and carefully coordinated order. The northern flank, where Barbarigo's Venetians faced Sirocco's Egyptian squadron along the shallow water close against the coastline, produced some of the single bloodiest fighting of the entire day, because Sirocco, familiar with these same coastal waters, attempted to slip a portion of his own force between Barbarigo's line and the shore itself, a manoeuvre that briefly threatened to encircle the Venetian flank entirely before running into shallows several Ottoman pilots had apparently misjudged, grounding a number of Ottoman vessels and turning what might have been a decisive flanking manoeuvre into a chaotic close-quarters melee, fought in water shallow enough by several accounts that some of the fighting spilled directly into the sea itself, soldiers from both fleets wading and swimming between grounded and grappled ships in a scene that eyewitness accounts describe as approaching something closer to a land battle, fought waist-deep in blood-reddened water than any conventional naval engagement. Barbarigo himself, by several accounts already an experienced and well-regarded commander, well into his own 60s by the time this battle found him, directing this same desperate fighting from his own flagship's exposed command position, was struck in the eye by an arrow in the battle's early hours, a wound that would prove fatal within days, and Barbarigo's own death, alongside the deaths of a considerable number of his own senior Venetian officers in that same brutal flank engagement, very nearly broke the Christian left entirely before reinforcements, redirected from elsewhere along the Christian line once the scale of the crisis on the northern flank became clear, arrived to stabilise what had, for close to an hour, been the single most dangerous moment of the entire battle for the Christian coalition. Sirocco himself was killed in the same fighting, and his own division, having lost both its commander and a considerable portion of its own fleet either sunk, grounded or captured, effectively ceased to exist as an organised fighting force well before the rest of the battle had been decided, a lopsided outcome on this single flank that several historians have suggested, on its own, accounted for a genuinely disproportionate share of the day's total Ottoman losses. It is worth dwelling a little longer on the specific texture of that same northern engagement, because the shallow water Sirocco had hoped to use against Barbarigo's own flank instead became, for a considerable number of Ottoman vessels attempting the same manoeuvre, a trap of their own making, galleys running aground in water too shallow for their own draught, and becoming, in effect, fixed and helpless gun platforms for Venetian ships to close with and destroy at comparative leisure, and several surviving accounts describe Venetian soldiers, once their own ships had run alongside these same grounded Ottoman vessels, wading directly through waist-deep water to board them, a specific and almost absurd image, men fighting a naval battle on foot in the shallows of a gulf, that captures better than almost any other single detail from that entire day exactly how chaotic and how far removed from any orderly, textbook naval engagement the actual fighting at Lepanto had become within the first hour of contact. Barbarigo himself, struck in the eye as this account has already told you, reportedly refused to leave his own command position even after the wound, continuing to direct the fighting from his own flagship's deck for some time before the wound's own severity finally forced him below, dying, as this account has already told you, days later of an injury that a modern battlefield surgeon would very likely have been able to treat, a specific and quietly tragic detail that sits alongside so many others this account has already shown you tonight, a man who might, in a different century, have survived a wound that 455 years ago simply had no answer for. The southern flank's own fighting before Uluç Ali's decisive breakthrough this account has already described was no less brutal for having ended, on the Christian side, considerably less disastrously than the crisis unfolding simultaneously along the northern coastline, Doria's own Genoese galleys, and Uluç Ali's Ottoman-Algerian squadron trading fire, and closing for boarding across a stretch of open water considerably wider than the cramped northern shallows. A difference in terrain that gave both commanders, and particularly the more experienced and more tactically inventive Uluç Ali, considerably more room to manoeuvre, to feint, and to probe for exactly the kind of gap this account has already told you he eventually found and exploited, a Corsair admiral's own decades of raiding experience, honed across a career spent finding precisely this kind of weakness in less experienced opponents, paying its own dividend on the single largest stage that same career would ever be tested on. It is hard not to notice, too, the specific fate of the Knights of Malta's own flagship. This account has already told you Uluç Ali captured in the fighting along that same southern flank, because the ship's own capture and the near-total loss of its own crew struck the Knight's own order with a grief that several surviving accounts describe as genuinely severe, even amid a battle that had, everywhere else along the line gone so overwhelmingly in the Christian fleet's own favour, a specific reminder that a victory this lopsided in its own aggregate arithmetic still fell, in its own actual lived experience, with real and uneven weight, crushing for the handful of crews caught on the wrong end of a single skilled enemy commander's own well-timed breakthrough, even as the wider battle around them was already being decided in exactly the opposite direction. The order would spend years afterward attempting, through diplomatic channels and through the occasional prisoner exchange this account has already told you both empires practiced, to recover some trace of the ship or of the men who had served aboard it, an effort that met, by most surviving accounts, with only partial and unsatisfying success. One more small and largely forgotten grief tucked inside the much larger and much more celebrated story this whole night has been telling you. The centre where flagship met flagship. At the centre of the battle line where Don Juan's own flagship, the Real, closed directly with Ali Pasha's own flagship, the Sultana, the fighting produced the single most symbolically weighted engagement of the entire day. Two Supreme Commanders' own vessels grappled together bow to bow, their own soldiers fighting hand to hand across deck separated, at the engagement's closest point, by only the width of a single boarding plank, while the ships immediately surrounding each flagship fought their own desperate tangled engagements in the churning water around them. Ali Pasha's own flagship carried, by several accounts, an unusually large contingent of the Ottoman fleet's own most experienced soldiers, and the fighting around the Sultana raged for well over an hour, with boarding parties from both sides crossing back and forth across the locked ships in waves, Spanish soldiers gaining the Sultana's own deck only to be pushed back, and Ottoman soldiers briefly gaining a foothold aboard the Real before being repelled in turn, a grinding, close-quarters struggle that several eyewitness accounts describe as the single most ferocious, hand-to-hand fighting anyone present had ever personally witnessed. The engagement at the centre finally turned in the battle's middle hours, when Ali Pasha himself was struck by most accounts by musket fire and killed on his own quarterdeck, and it is worth naming honestly exactly what happened to his own body in the moments immediately following his death, because a Spanish soldier, whose own name several competing accounts record differently, and whose exact identity has never been fully settled by historians, found the fallen commander's body, cut off his own head, and, in an act that several contemporary chroniclers describe with a certain uneasy fascination, mounted it on a pike raised high enough for the surrounding Ottoman soldiers to see, a piece of grim battlefield theatre, gruesome by any modern standard but entirely legible to every soldier watching it from either side of that same century's own battlefield conventions, that produced an almost immediate and dramatic collapse in Ottoman morale across the centre of the line. Soldiers who had been fighting with real and sustained ferocity only minutes earlier, abandoning their own positions once the sight of their own Supreme Commander's severed head made unmistakably clear that the battle's central command had simply ceased to exist. It is worth naming, too, the specific and genuinely tender detail this account is going to hold up against the severed head. This same story has just shown you raised on a pike, because among the captives taken aboard Ali Pasha's own flagship in the fighting's final chaotic minutes were two of the Ottoman commander's own young sons, boys whose own exact ages surviving accounts record only approximately, somewhere in their early teens, and Don Juan, once the fighting had ended and the boys were brought before him, chose, in a gesture several contemporary chroniclers on both sides of the conflict recorded with genuine admiration, to treat them not as prizes to be sold or ransomed, in the ordinary way captured enemy nobility of this period so often were, but as guests housing them with real care aboard his own flagship, and eventually, some months later, arranging their own safe and unransomed return to Constantinople. A single act of mercy. This account offers you here deliberately, sitting as it does only a few short paragraphs away from a pike bearing their own father's head, because this whole long night has tried to show you, again and again, that cruelty and mercy in warfare rarely divide themselves neatly along the lines of victor and vanquished, and a single afternoon capable of producing both a severed head raised in triumph and two frightened boys treated with genuine gentleness by the very fleet that had just killed their father, tells you something true about how completely war scrambles the moral categories it is so often described in. Don Juan, by several accounts, was genuinely troubled by the sight of the pike once it was brought before him, and ordered it taken down, a small gesture of respect for a defeated enemy commander that sits, worth naming honestly, in real and interesting tension with the considerably less merciful treatment this same war had already shown Marco Antonio Bragadin only weeks earlier, a reminder that cruelty and mercy in warfare rarely divide themselves neatly along the lines of which side happened to be practicing which. It is worth remembering, too, exactly how the Venetian practice this account has already told you about, arming free oarsmen and letting them fight alongside the soldiers they had spent weeks rowing into position, actually played out once the fighting at the centre genuinely closed, because Venetian galleys, uniquely among the Christian fleet's own ships, could call on their own oar benches for a meaningful reserve of additional fighting men at exactly the moment a ship's own soldiers began to fall. Free Venetian citizens who had trained, at least to some degree, in the use of arms, even while serving primarily as rowers, a structural advantage that several modern naval historians credit with helping several individual Venetian vessels survive engagements that would otherwise have overwhelmed them, and a specific and telling contrast to the Ottoman fleet's own oar benches, crewed, as this account has already told you, predominantly by chained and unarmed captives who could offer their own ships no comparable reserve of fighting strength once a crisis at the rail actually arrived. It is worth remembering, too, that Spanish galleys, unlike their Venetian counterparts, generally kept their own convict and slave oarsmen chained and unarmed throughout an engagement as a matter of settled policy, a specific and consequential difference in practice between the two largest Christian contingents fighting under the very same banner, meaning that the fleet this account has already told you assembled itself out of mutual suspicion at Messina, carried that same lack of full agreement into the battle itself, fighting side by side under a single supreme commander, while still, in this one specific and consequential respect, operating according to two genuinely different sets of standing rules for who aboard each ship was actually permitted to fight for their own freedom and who was not. Miguel de Cervantes, still fevered and still holding his own post at the Marquesa's boat, despite his own captain's earlier reluctance to arm him, fought through this same centre-line chaos as one soldier among many thousands, and it was in the fighting around his own vessel, sometime in these same middle hours of the battle, that Cervantes took the wounds that would mark the rest of his own life, 2 shots to the chest that he would carry, by his own account written decades later, without any lasting complaint, and a third that shattered his own left hand so completely that it never properly healed, leaving him, for the remaining 54 years of his own life, unable to use it, a wound Cervantes would come to describe in the prologue to the second part of the novel that made him immortal, not as a source of shame, but as the finest thing that had ever happened to him, earned, in his own words, in the highest occasion that past ages have witnessed, or future ages can hope to witness. Soldier's own pride in a wound that had cost him a hand and given him, in exchange, a claim to having stood at Lepanto that he would carry, with evident satisfaction, and without a trace of the bitterness so much of his own later life might easily have earned him for the rest of his days. It is worth naming plainly exactly what medical care actually looked like for the many thousands of men wounded that same afternoon, because 16th century naval surgery, practiced aboard cramped, blood-slicked galley decks by barber surgeons whose own formal medical training varied enormously, and whose own surgical instruments amounted in most cases to knives, saws and cauterizing irons, offered a wounded soldier considerably better odds of survival than no treatment at all, but considerably worse odds than even the most basic modern medicine would offer the very same injury today. Gunshot wounds like the ones Cervantes carried away from the battle, treated primarily through amputation of any limb too badly shattered to save. Wound cleaning that amounted in practice to whatever fresh water or wine happened to be available aboard a given ship, and an infection rate in the days and weeks following any battle of this scale that several modern medical historians estimate killed as many men in the weeks after Lepanto as the fighting itself had killed on the day. A specific and sobering addition to the death toll this account has already given you. A toll that the immediate battlefield casualty counts, however carefully assembled, could never have fully captured, because a soldier who died of a festering wound 3 weeks later, aboard a hospital ship bound for Messina or Naples, rarely made it into any muster roll counting the dead of the 7th of October specifically. The southern flank, a gap opened, and an admiral's escape. On the battle's southern wing, where Gianandrea Doria's own Genoese squadron faced Uluç Ali's Ottoman Algerian division, the fighting took a shape that would leave, in the centuries of retelling that followed, the single most persistent controversy of the entire battle. Doria, whether out of the same caution that had shaped his own earlier objections in the War Council, a genuine tactical concern that Uluç Ali's own fleet, positioned further out toward open water, might attempt to swing around and outflank the Christian right entirely. Or, as several of his own contemporary critics were quick to allege, and several modern historians continue to debate without full resolution, out of a more calculated reluctance to risk his own family's own considerable private fleet in the war's most dangerous fighting, extended his own line further south than his fellow commanders had expected, opening a gap between his own division and the Christian centre that Uluç Ali, watching the Christian formation with the same tactical sharpness that had built his own formidable reputation across decades of corsair warfare, recognised and exploited within minutes, driving a portion of his own fleet directly through that same gap to strike at the Christian centre's own exposed flank, rather than continuing to engage Doria's ships head-on. This same manoeuvre produced, for a genuinely dangerous stretch of the battle's middle hours, real chaos along the boundary between the Christian centre and right. Several Christian galleys caught isolated and overwhelmed before reinforcements could reach them, including in the single most painful loss of the entire engagement for the Knights of Malta, the Order's own flagship, captured by Uluç Ali's own forces in fighting that killed nearly the entire Christian crew aboard it. A specific and bitter loss given how much blood the same order had already spent defending its own island against an Ottoman fleet only 6 years earlier. Uluç Ali, watching the wider battle turn decisively against the Ottoman fleet, as news and visible signs of Ali Pasha's own death spread along the line, made the calculated decision, once it became clear that continuing to press his own local advantage could not possibly reverse a battle already lost everywhere else, to withdraw his own squadron in good order, towing his captured Maltese prize behind him, and sail west out of the Gulf before the full weight of the reorganising Christian fleet could be brought to bear against him. A disciplined and genuinely skillful retreat that preserved somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 Ottoman vessels, very nearly the only meaningful remnant of the entire Ottoman battle fleet to survive the day in any organised fighting condition at all. Consider, too, honestly, that Uluç Ali's own escape and the captured Maltese standard he carried back to Constantinople as proof that at least one corner of this catastrophic day had gone the Ottoman fleet's way, would earn him, once he reached the Sultan's own court, both genuine honour, Selim elevating him afterward to the position of Capudan Pasha, supreme commander of the entire Ottoman navy, in recognition of having salvaged the single least disastrous chapter of an otherwise total defeat and a lasting reputation among Christian chroniclers who wrote about the battle in the years that followed. as the one Ottoman commander who had actually out-generalled his own Christian counterpart that day, a specific and pointed reputation that did Gianandrea Doria's own, already strained standing among his fellow commanders no favours whatsoever in the years of recrimination that followed the battle's otherwise overwhelming Christian victory. It is worth remembering honestly exactly how that same recrimination actually played out once the fleet returned home, because the argument over Doria's own conduct did not stay confined to private grumbling among commanders, but spilled out into open and sometimes genuinely bitter public dispute across the following years, Venetian chroniclers in particular publishing accounts that treated Doria's own widened line with real suspicion bordering on open accusation, while Genoese and Spanish writers defending the same admiral's own reputation produced their own competing versions, insisting his own conduct had been entirely sound. A specific and telling reminder, worth sitting with for a moment before this account moves on, that even a battle this celebrated, this thoroughly and unambiguously won by the coalition as a whole, could not actually produce a single agreed account of its own events among the very allies who had fought it side by side, each nation's own chroniclers already, within months of the victory, beginning to shape the story toward whichever version reflected best on their own countrymen. A habit of national myth. Making this account has already shown you shaping the memory of nearly every battle it has ever carried you through, and one Lepanto, for all its own genuine and considerable glory, proved no more immune to than any other. An afternoon that ended in slaughter the victors rarely dwell on. By the time the fighting finally guttered out across the Gulf's own western waters in the late afternoon, somewhere between 4 and 6 hours after the first cannon fire from the galleasses, the outcome was no longer genuinely in doubt anywhere along the line, except the small corner of open water where Ulus Ali's own squadron was still making its own disciplined escape. And it is here, at the point where popular memory of Lepanto tends to soften into a single clean image of Christian deliverance, that this account owes you the same honest accounting it has already given you of Nicosia and of Famagusta, because the closing hours of the battle were not, by any surviving account from either side, a moment of restrained or chivalrous conduct on the part of the victors. Ottoman soldiers and sailors from sunk, disabled and abandoned vessels filled the Gulf's own waters by the thousands as the afternoon wore on, and Christian soldiers, several eyewitness accounts record with a bluntness later, more celebratory retellings of the battle have generally chosen to leave out, showed little inclination to take prisoners in those final hours, killing a great many Ottoman soldiers and sailors as they struggled in the water, rather than pulling them aboard, a pattern of killing driven by some genuine combination of battle fury, built up across an entire afternoon of close-quarters violence, plain revenge for Cyprus and for Bragadin's own well-known fate, and the simple logistical fact that a fleet already crowded past capacity with its own wounded had little room or inclination to take on thousands of enemy prisoners it would then have to feed, guard, and transport. It is worth naming, too, exactly what happened aboard the Ottoman ships that were captured rather than sunk outright, because the tens of thousands of Christian galley slaves this account has already told you were chained to Ottoman oar benches were freed in their thousands as those same ships fell into Christian hands across the afternoon, a genuinely joyous, and by every surviving account genuinely emotional moment for men who had, in a great many individual cases, spent years chained to a single bench. And it is worth naming, honestly, that at least some of these same newly freed men, finding weapons and finding suddenly their own former captors defenceless before them, turn that same freedom immediately toward violent and understandable retribution against the Ottoman crews who had held them in chains, a specific and human detail that neither condemns nor excuses the men who did it, only insists, as this account always insists, that you hold the full and complicated human truth of a battle like this one, rather than the single flattering image that later commemoration would prefer to leave you with. Nobody counted the dead that afternoon with anything approaching real precision, and so nobody, 4.5 centuries later, actually knows the exact toll this single day's fighting exacted, though the careful modern estimates historians have assembled from surviving muster records, captured ship inventories, and the considerably less reliable but still suggestive claims of contemporary chroniclers on both sides converge on a broad and genuinely staggering range, somewhere between 20 and 30,000 Ottoman dead, a figure no single surviving source ever counted in full, and every later source has only estimated the overwhelming majority of them in the water, or aboard sinking and captured vessels in the battle's final hours, against somewhere between 7 and 9,500 Christian dead, a lopsided ratio that reflects, more than any single tactical brilliance on the Christian side, the simple compounding arithmetic of a battle in which one entire enemy division, Sirocco's, was effectively annihilated. Another, Ali Pasha's own centre, lost its commander and collapsed into rout, and only Uluç Ali's own disciplined third managed anything resembling an organised withdrawal. Something in the range of 10 to 12,000 Christian galley slaves, men from a dozen different nations and a dozen different ports, were freed from Ottoman ships across that same afternoon, men whose own individual names and individual stories have almost entirely vanished from the historical record, counted, where they were counted at all, only as a single aggregate figure in a victory dispatch, a genuinely enormous number of individual human liberations that popular memory of this battle has folded into a single triumphant footnote, rather than the tens of thousands of separate, specific griefs and reunions it actually represented to the men themselves, and to whatever families, in whatever scattered corner of the Mediterranean coastline, might still have been waiting for them. Nobody kept a separate count of the oarsmen, who never got the chance to be freed at all, the men chained below decks aboard galleys that sank outright rather than surrendered, drowned still, shackled to the very benches. This account has already told you they had, in a great many cases, been chained to for years, unable to swim free even had the chaos of a sinking ship somehow given them the opportunity, and it is this same specific and largely unrecorded category of death. A captive killed not by the enemy he was forced to serve but by the simple physics of a chain and a sinking hull that most completely escapes the careful modern casualty. Estimates this account has already given you, because a muster roll counts soldiers and a captured ship inventory counts vessels, but almost no surviving record from either side troubled itself to count, with any real precision, exactly how many chained men went down with the ships that carried them into a battle whose own outcome, whichever way it fell, was never going to set them free either way. Of the Ottoman fleet's own, roughly 250 to 280 vessels, somewhere around 130 were captured outright by the victorious Christian fleet, and perhaps 50 more sunk or burned, meaning that something close to 2/3 of the entire Ottoman battle fleet ceased to exist, in any usable naval sense, in the space of a single afternoon, against Christian losses that most careful accounts place at somewhere around a dozen galleys sunk outright, a disparity in material losses even more lopsided than the disparity in human casualties. And it was this same staggering material disparity, arriving in dispatches that reached Venice within days and Rome and Madrid not long after, that would produce across the following weeks a wave of public celebration in Catholic Europe, unlike anything the continent had seen in living memory. It is hard not to notice, before this account lets you share fully in that same celebration, the considerably quieter and considerably less recorded experience of the women left behind in every port city this fleet had sailed from, because 140,000 men crowded into that single gulf on the 7th of October, left behind them across Spain, Venice, the Italian states, and every smaller town that had sent its own contingent of soldiers or sailors, wives, mothers, sisters and daughters, who spent that same October in the particular and specific agony of simply not knowing, weeks sometimes passing between the battle itself and any reliable word of a single individual husband's or son's or brother's own fate, awaiting this account's own surviving source's record only rarely and only in passing. A line in a merchant's private letter noting his own wife's relief at finally receiving word, a parish register, Some were recording a widow's remarriage years later once a missing husband's own death had finally been confirmed beyond doubt. Fragments that hint at an entire, largely undocumented landscape of grief and relief, playing out in 10,000 households at once while the battle's own commanders were being celebrated in bronze and in fresco. Consider too that this same weighting fell with particular and compounding weight on the families of the ordinary rowers and soldiers this account has already told you outnumbered the noble volunteers and named commanders by many thousands to one. Families with neither the standing nor the connections to receive word quickly through official channels, and who often learned their own household's fate only weeks or months later, if they learned it with any real certainty at all. A specific and unequal distribution of grief and of information alike that tracked, as it so often does in every war this channel has ever told you about, considerably more closely with a family's own social rank than with the actual scale of what that family had risked. News that travelled faster than anyone expected, and a pope who wept. The first word of the victory reached Venice on the 18th of October, 11 days after the battle itself, carried by a fast galley whose own captain, by the vivid account several Venetian chroniclers recorded, brought the news ashore so quickly and with such visible joy that the city's own governing council initially struggled to credit a victory this complete. A hesitation that dissolved within hours into citywide celebration, church bells ringing across the entire city. The Republic's own shops and government offices closed for days of Thanksgiving, and a formal state ceremony of gratitude held in the Basilica of San Marco itself, a scene of collective relief from a republic that had spent the better part of the preceding 18 months absorbing one grim piece of news after another: Nicosia's fall, Famagusta's siege, and finally the specific horror of Bragadin's own death, before finally receiving in this single dispatch the first genuinely unambiguous good news the entire war had yet produced. Don Juan himself, sailing the battered fleet first to Corfu to bury the dead and treat the wounded, and then onward across the following weeks to Naples, was received, upon his own arrival in that city, with a triumphal procession several contemporary accounts describe in terms that deliberately and self-consciously echoed the ceremonial triumphs of ancient Roman generals returning from a great conquest. Crowds lining the streets, church bells ringing continuously, and the city's own Spanish viceroy receiving the young commander with honours that, for a brief season, made the illegitimate son of an emperor the single most celebrated man in Catholic Europe. A reception that stood in real and poignant contrast to the considerably quieter and considerably less triumphant reception this same fleet's own thousands of ordinary wounded soldiers and freed galley slaves received once they finally made their own way back to whatever scattered towns and villages they called home. What a visitor can still find if they know where to look extends further than the museum pieces this account has already told you about, because monuments to individual participants in this same battle stand scattered across a number of European cities to this day. A statue of Don John of Austria in Madrid, ships across several different national navies having carried the name Lepanto in his and the battle's own honour at various points across the 4.5 centuries since, and Spain's own popular memory of the battle still occasionally invokes Cervantes's make of the underlying claim of direct causation. The Mediterranean settled slowly into an exhausted and uneasy truce. It is worth returning briefly to the wider Ottoman-Habsburg contest. This account has already told you continued grinding on after Venice's own separate peace in 1573, because the following 7 years produced a series of smaller campaigns, raids and counter-raids along the North African coast, Spanish and Ottoman forces, trading control of Tunis back and forth more than once in fighting that never again approached the scale of Lepanto itself, until both empires, each increasingly preoccupied with other, and in several respects more pressing concerns. Spain with its own deepening war in the Low Countries and its own growing rivalry with England, the Ottoman Empire with a costly and protracted war against Safavid Persia on its own eastern frontier, finally negotiated a truce in 1580 that neither side ever formally called a lasting peace, but that held in practice, and with only occasional and comparatively minor violations, for the better part of the following century, a quiet and almost anticlimactic ending to a rivalry that had, for the better part of 2 generations, shaped the entire strategic imagination of the Mediterranean world. And it is worth naming plainly exactly what happened 3 generations later, because the strongest single piece of evidence for the more sceptical reading of Lepanto's own lasting significance arrived not in the years immediately following the battle, but in the middle of the following century, when an Ottoman fleet, rebuilt and modernised across the intervening 7 decades, launched a fresh invasion of Venice's own last major Mediterranean possession, the island of Crete, in 1645, opening a siege of the island's own capital, Candia, that would grind on, in one form or another, for 21 years, the longest siege in recorded European history, before the city finally fell to Ottoman forces in 1669, a full 98 years after the supposedly civilization-saving victory this whole night has been telling you about, and a plain and sobering demonstration that whatever psychological and symbolic rupture Lepanto had genuinely produced in 1571, it had done remarkably little to prevent the same Ottoman Empire from eventually taking, at its own patient leisure nearly a full century later, the very next major Venetian island the empire's own strategic interest happened to settle on. This account names Crete here, briefly, and without walking you through its own separate and considerably longer story in full tonight, only because it offers the single clearest possible answer to the question this whole section has been weighing: a Mediterranean world in 1572 that had genuinely, if temporarily, stunned itself with the scale of what a unified Christian coalition could accomplish against Ottoman naval power, and a Mediterranean world in 1669 that had, in the plainest practical terms, returned to very nearly the same long, grinding, slowly Ottoman-favouring pattern of territorial contest that had defined the region for 2 centuries before a single afternoon in a Greek Gulf ever briefly interrupted it. It is worth remembering, too, exactly how this same news actually spread once it left Venice and Rome, because the 16th century possessed, in the printing press this channel has already told you, reshaped nearly every other story it has ever carried you through, a genuinely powerful mechanism for turning a single naval battle, fought off the Greek coast, into a shared continental event within a matter of weeks. Printers across Italy, Spain, Germany and France rushing to produce cheap broadsides and pamphlets describing the victory, several of them illustrated with crude woodcut images of the battle that bore, by most modern assessments, only the loosest possible relationship to what had actually happened in that Gulf. And it was this same flood of printed material, reaching literate and semi-literate audiences across a continent that had never before been able to share news of a single distant event with anything approaching this speed or this scale, that did as much as any sermon or any papal proclamation to fix Lepanto, almost immediately and almost permanently, in the popular imagination of an entire generation of Europeans who had never come anywhere near that gulf themselves. A beard grows back, an arm does not. It is hard not to notice, once the celebration in Venice and Rome finally quieted enough for cooler strategic minds to actually assess what the battle had and had not accomplished, exactly how quickly the Ottoman Empire itself set about proving that a single afternoon's naval catastrophe, however total, did not automatically translate into the kind of lasting strategic collapse a great many Christian observers, swept up in the genuine and understandable euphoria of October and November 1571, allowed themselves to believe it would, a euphoria this account has already shown you spreading through printed pamphlets and cathedral sermons alike, and one that a sober Ottoman court, grieving its own dead while simultaneously counting its own remaining timber reserves, never actually shared in anything like the same measure. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, the same Grand Vizier this account has already told you, had been genuinely reluctant to open this war against Venice in the first place, oversaw, across the following winter and spring, a shipbuilding effort of almost staggering speed and scale, drawing on the Ottoman Empire's own considerable timber reserves, its own well-organised state shipyards, and a treasury that, whatever the very real human cost of losing nearly an entire fleet in a single afternoon, had not actually been bankrupted by the defeat in any lasting structural sense, and by the summer of 1572, barely 9 months after Lepanto, an Ottoman fleet numbering, by several contemporary reports, well over 200 galleys, very nearly matching the size of the fleet destroyed the previous October, put to sea once again, a recovery so rapid that it stunned Venetian and Spanish observers who had assumed, in the immediate aftermath of the battle, that Ottoman naval power in the Mediterranean had been broken for a generation. Socollu himself, in an exchange several later chroniclers record him, having with a Venetian diplomat sent to negotiate in the war's final stages, is reported to have made this specific and rather memorable point, though this account cannot vouch for the exact wording any more than it could vouch for the wine story attached to Salem earlier tonight, that the Ottoman Empire had lost at Lepanto only a fleet, a thing that could be rebuilt within a single winter given sufficient timber and sufficient will, while Venice, in surrendering Cyprus, had lost a limb that no treaty or shipyard could ever grow back, a comparison that captured, with real and uncomfortable precision, exactly how the war's actual strategic ledger would ultimately balance out. Venice, faced with an Ottoman fleet rebuilt to something approaching its former strength, and with a Holy League whose own Spanish half, Philip's own attention increasingly consumed by his war in the Low Countries, and by fresh anxieties about French and English naval activity in the Atlantic, showed little appetite for another expensive campaigning season, chasing a war whose central prize, Cyprus itself, had already been lost beyond any realistic hope of recovery, opened separate and secret negotiations with Constantinople in the second half of 1572, precisely the kind of unilateral peace-seeking Philip's own advisers had warned, at the League's own founding, that Venice would eventually pursue. It is hard not to notice, plainly, exactly how exhausted Venice's own treasury actually was by this point in the war, because the Republic had spent something in the range of several million ducats across the 3 years of fighting. This account has walked you through tonight, financing not only its own share of the Holy League's combined fleet, but the entire separate cost of the Cyprus campaign itself, an expenditure so large that Venetian tax records from this same period show the Republic resorting to emergency measures rarely used even in the darkest years of its own long history, forced loans levied on its own wealthier citizens, the sale of noble titles and government offices to raise immediate cash, and a public debt that would take decades to fully unwind, a specific financial exhaustion that mattered enormously to the Senate's own calculation in seeking peace in 1572, because a republic whose own prosperity depended, as this account has already told you, on trade rather than on conquest could not indefinitely sustain a war this expensive, purely for the sake of a coalition's own continued honour, whatever the human cost of abandoning the coalition's own stated purpose. The Treaty Venice ultimately signed with the Ottoman Empire, concluded in March of 1573 without any prior consultation with either Spain or the Papacy, formally ceded Cyprus to Ottoman rule for good. An island the island's own Christian and Orthodox population would remain under Ottoman administration for the following 3 centuries, and required Venice to pay a substantial war indemnity, 300,000 ducats spread across 3 years, in exchange for the restoration of Venetian trading privileges across Ottoman territory, a settlement that Philip II and Pope Gregory XIII, Pius V, having died in the spring of 1572 without living to see this same outcome, both received with real and bitter anger, regarding it, not unreasonably, as Venice trading away the entire strategic purpose of the Holy League's own continued existence in exchange for the resumption of its own commercial convenience. The Holy League itself, deprived of its own founding purpose, and of Venice's own considerable naval contribution, dissolved shortly afterward, its own combined fleet never assembling again in anything like the strength it had mustered at Messina in the autumn of 1571. And the broader Ottoman-Habsburg contest for control of the Mediterranean would grind on, through a series of smaller and considerably less decisive engagements, until the two empires finally settled into an uneasy and largely stable truce in 1580, a truce that held, in its broad outlines, for the better part of the following century. It is worth naming plainly. because this channel has never asked you to accept a battle's own legend without weighing it honestly against what actually followed it, that a considerable body of serious modern historical scholarship, most influentially the French historian Fernand Braudel's own monumental study of the Mediterranean world in this same period, has argued that Lepanto's genuine strategic significance has been substantially overstated by 4.5 centuries of Christian European commemoration, a battle that felt, to the men who fought it and to the Europe that celebrated it, like a civilization-defining turning point, but that left the underlying balance of power between the Ottoman Empire and its Christian rivals in the Mediterranean essentially unchanged within 18 months of the guns falling silent, Cyprus permanently lost, an Ottoman fleet rebuilt to near its former strength, and a Mediterranean contest that would continue, largely along the same lines it had followed before the battle, for decades still to come. And it is worth naming with equal honesty the case the other side of this same historical argument makes, because a number of historians have pushed back against reading Lepanto as strategically meaningless simply because it did not permanently cripple Ottoman naval power, pointing out that the battle did mark, in a way, the following decades would bear out, even if slowly and unevenly, the effective end of any serious Ottoman ambition toward further large-scale naval conquest in the Western Mediterranean, that it destroyed, in a single afternoon, an entire generation of the Ottoman Navy's own most experienced sailors and officers in a way that raw ship count alone cannot fully capture, seasoned crews being considerably harder to rebuild in 9 months than hulls and rigging, and that it gave a Christian Europe that had spent the better part of a century assuming Ottoman naval supremacy was simply an immovable fact of Mediterranean life, its first genuinely decisive proof, whatever its limits, that the Empire's own navy could, in fact, be beaten in open battle, a psychological and symbolic inheritance that would outlast the specific and considerably more modest strategic gains the battle itself actually produced. A more recent generation of naval historians, working from a considerably more technical angle than Braudel's own broad, civilizational sweep, has added a further and genuinely useful layer to this same debate, arguing, most influentially in the specific and detailed tactical scholarship of the American historian John Francis Gilmartin, that Lepanto's real significance lies less in its own immediate strategic consequences than in what it revealed about a fundamental shift already underway in the technology of war itself, because the battle's own lopsided casualty figures owed a very great deal to the simple fact that Spanish and Italian infantry, armed predominantly with muskets and arquebuses by 1571, could fire considerably faster and considerably more lethally at close range than Ottoman soldiers still relying, in large part, on the composite bow this account has already told you, remained standard equipment across a substantial share of the Ottoman fleet's own fighting complement, a specific technological gap that Gilmartin and other scholars in his own tradition have argued mattered considerably more to the battle's actual outcome than any of the grander strategic or providential explanations both contemporary chroniclers and later national mythmakers have generally preferred, a reading of the battle that would suggest, if broadly correct, that Lepanto marks less a triumph of Christian civilization over Islamic civilization in any broad cultural sense than a considerably narrower and more mundane triumph of one specific and rapidly spreading military technology over another that had not yet fully caught up to it. An unglamorous but genuinely important corrective. This account owes you before it lets the battle's own grander legend stand entirely unchallenged. This account is not going to pretend to settle, in a single night's telling, an argument serious historians have carried on for the better part of a century, but it will say plainly, because the channel that brings you these stories has never believed a battle needs to have single-handedly saved a civilization in order to be worth understanding in full, that both of these readings can be true at once, that Lepanto was, in the narrowest strategic terms, a victory whose own practical fruits Venice traded away within 18 months for the resumption of its own commerce, and that Lepanto was, at exactly the same time, a genuine and lasting rupture in the psychological architecture of an entire continent's relationship with a naval power it had, until that single October afternoon, never actually seen beaten. The last great fight between oars, painted onto ceilings that still stand. It is worth remembering, too, exactly how much of a hinge point Lepanto actually represented in the much longer history of naval warfare itself, because this same battle is remembered by most modern military historians as the last major naval engagement in Western history decided primarily by oar-powered galleys locked in close, boarding-style combat, rather than by sailing ships exchanging cannon fire at range, a mode of naval warfare stretching back, in its essential form, to the trireme battles of ancient Greece this channel has already carried you through on other nights, battles fought, in their own distant century, in very nearly these same eastern Mediterranean waters, by oarsmen facing very nearly the same basic tactical problem of closing, boarding, and overwhelming an enemy crew at close quarters that this account has just spent so much of tonight walking you through in exhaustive and blood-soaked detail, a genuinely striking continuity of method across 2,000 years that makes the Gulf of Patras, in its own way, as much a closing chapter in a story that began with Athenian and Persian oarsmen as it is an opening chapter in the story of the broadside-firing warship still to come, finally giving way, across the following century, to the broadside-firing galleon and ship of the line that would come to dominate every major naval conflict fought anywhere in the world from the later 16th century onward, a transition that makes the Gulf of Patras, in a sense few of the men fighting there that October afternoon could have fully appreciated, the closing scene of a chapter in naval warfare that had run, essentially unbroken, for well over 2,000 years before that single day finally brought it to its own quiet, blood-soaked end. The victory produced, across the following decades, an outpouring of European artistic commemoration matched by remarkably few other single battles in the whole of the early modern period. The Venetian painter Titian, already in his own final years, completing a large votive painting showing Philip II offering his own infant son to heaven in gratitude for the victory. The younger Venetian master Paolo Veronese producing his own celebrated allegorical depiction of the battle for the Doge's own palace, and Giorgio Vasari working at the Vatican itself, filling an entire ceiling of the papal apartments with frescoes celebrating Pius V's own role in assembling the coalition that won the day. Images that a visitor can still stand beneath in Rome and in Venice alike this same week, 4.5 centuries after the paint first dried, a physical and continuous inheritance of celebration that few battles from this same century left behind them in anything like comparable scale or comparable permanence. It found its way into poetry too, considerably later than the battle itself, when the English writer G.K. Chesterton, working in the early years of the 20th century, composed a long narrative poem simply titled Lepanto, a work that this account is not going to quote directly, both because a full recitation would carry this story considerably further from sleep than a single evening's telling should, and because the channel bringing you this story tonight has always preferred to describe rather than to borrow, but a poem worth naming for the sheer and lasting hold it took on English language memory of this same battle, painting Don John of Austria in the kind of galloping, romantic, almost mythic register that turned a 24-year-old commander's own genuinely complicated historical record into something closer to a chivalric legend. A poem that several generations of English schoolchildren across the better part of the following century would be assigned to memorise, carrying the specific cadence and the specific romance of this single Greek Gulf afternoon into English-speaking classrooms 3 centuries and an entire ocean away from where the actual fighting took place. Spain itself had already produced its own considerable body of literary celebration within a year of the battle, the poet and Augustinian friar Fernando de Herrera, publishing in 1572, a lengthy ode explicitly commemorating the victory in the kind of elevated, classically inflected Spanish verse that was, by this point in the century, becoming the dominant literary fashion at the Spanish court, a poem that circulated widely enough among educated Spanish readers of its own generation to help fix Lepanto, alongside the more visual commemoration this account has already described unfolding in Venice and Rome as a specifically Spanish as well as a broadly Catholic triumph, a national pride in the victory that would remain a genuine and durable feature of Spanish popular memory for centuries afterward, surfacing again and again, as this account has already shown you, in everything from Cervantes' own proud nickname to the ships later Spanish navies would choose to name after this single, distant October afternoon. And Miguel de Cervantes himself, whose own shattered hand this account has already carried you through in the fighting aboard the Marquesa, went on, across the 3.5 decades of life still ahead of him after that October afternoon, to a career that reads, taken as a whole, like a genuinely strange and often genuinely difficult argument against the very glory the battle itself was so quickly wrapped in, captured by Barbary corsairs only 4 years later on his own voyage home to Spain, and held as a slave in Algiers for 5 years before his own ransom was finally paid, and returning at last to a Spain whose own enchanted and overextended economy, a story this channel has already told you about in full on another night, had remarkably little practical use to offer a maimed veteran of its own proudest naval victory beyond the modest and often thankless work of a provisions agent and a tax collector, a career that included, across its own considerable length, more than one stretch in debtor's prison before Cervantes, in his own late 50s, finally wrote the book that would make him immortal. This account is not going to walk you again through the full length of that same later life or the novel it eventually produced, a story this channel has already told in full elsewhere, and one you are welcome to seek out on your own if the shape of it interests you. A life that carried him from a Greek Gulf to an Algerian slave pen to a Spanish debtor's cell before it ever carried him to the writing desk, where his own name finally found its lasting fame. But it is worth naming plainly, before this story leaves Cervantes behind for good tonight, the particular and rather striking fact that the wound Cervantes carried away from this same battle, a hand he could never again use, became, in his own telling, and in the telling of nearly everyone who has written about him since, not a mark of bitterness but a mark of pride he wore for the rest of his own long and often difficult life, a soldier who never once, by any surviving account, regretted having gotten up from his own sickbed that October morning to take his post. What became of the men who lived past that October afternoon? It is worth pausing before this account moves toward its own close on the considerably shorter and considerably less triumphant paths that history actually had waiting for a number of the men this story has already introduced you to, because a battle this famous tends, in popular memory, to freeze its own participants at the moment of victory, and the years that followed treated a great many of them with a good deal less generosity than that single frozen image suggests. Don John of Austria, the young commander whose own decision to fight this account has already walked you through in detail, spent the 7 years remaining to him pursuing further military ambitions across the Mediterranean, and eventually in the Low Countries, this channel has already told you about on another night, appointed by his own half-brother Philip as governor of a rebellion. He proved considerably less able to pacify than he had been able to defeat an Ottoman fleet, and Don Juan died there in October of 1578, not in battle, but of typhus, at only 31 years old, a death several contemporary observers noted, not without a certain grim symmetry, arrived almost exactly 7 years to the day after the single greatest triumph of his own short and genuinely eventful life. It is worth remembering too the specific and genuinely strange journey his own body actually took after that death, because Philip, wanting his own half-brother interred with proper royal honour at the Escorial in Spain, rather than left in the Low Countries where he had died, and facing the practical difficulty of transporting a body across hundreds of miles of contested and war-torn territory without inviting interference from hostile forces along the route, had Don Juan's remains dismembered and smuggled south in several separate pieces, concealed among ordinary baggage and reassembled and given full formal burial only once every piece had safely reached Spanish soil, a specific and macabre detail. This account offers you not for shock alone, but because it belongs, in its own strange way, to the same pattern. This whole night has already shown you again and again a Bastille sold off stone by stone as souvenirs, a governor's skin stuffed with straw and paraded through a captured city, a body of legendary standing reduced, after death, to a logistics problem its own survivors solved with whatever grim practicality the moment actually required. Sebastiano Venier, the fiercely combative Venetian commander whose own insistence on immediate battle this account has already told you helped carry Don Juan's war council toward its own fateful decision, returned home to Venice a hero, and was elected in 1577 to the Republic's own highest office, Doge, serving in that role for barely a year before his own death, a fitting enough final honour for a man whose own stubborn insistence on fighting had done so much to make the victory itself possible in the first place. Ulucali, elevated, as this account has already told you, to Capudan Pasha, in recognition of his own skillful escape from the battle's wreckage, went on to rebuild and command the very Ottoman fleet Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, assembled with such remarkable speed the following spring, holding that same supreme naval command for a further 16 years until his own death in 1587, the single most senior Ottoman commander to emerge from the entire Cyprus War with his own career meaningfully advanced rather than ended by it. Lala Mustafa Pasha, whose own conduct at Famagusta this account has already described in full, suffered no formal punishment whatsoever for breaking the surrender terms he himself had signed, returning to Constantinople to genuine honour for having completed the conquest of Cyprus, and going on to further senior military commands, including campaigns against Georgia and the wider Caucasus, before his own death in 1580, a career that closed, this account has to note plainly, without the empire he served ever holding him to account in any meaningful way for the specific atrocity this whole story has already asked you to sit with. And Marcantonio Colonna, whose own contested claim to command this account has already described, returned to a distinguished continued career of his own, serving for a time afterward as the Spanish crown's own viceroy governing Sicily, a reminder that a battle this consequential reshuffled the careers of the men who survived it in directions that had remarkably little to do with which side of history's own later judgment they would eventually land on, and Selim II, the Sultan whose own decision to invade Cyprus this entire story is traced from its very first cause, did not live to see even 3 full years pass after the treaty that formally secured him the island he'd gone to war for, dying in Constantinople in December of 1574 in circumstances that several contemporary accounts describe. With an irony this account is obligated to name honestly rather than pass over. A fall suffered inside his own palace bathhouse while, by more than one surviving report, considerably the worse for the same wine that had given him his own popular nickname, a death that struck a great many observers at the time, and has struck a good many historians since, as a strangely fitting final chapter for a sultan whose own reputation, fairly or not, this account has already told you was built as much around a glass of Cypriot vintage as around the considerable empire he actually governed. How this account actually knows what happened in that Gulf, it is worth naming plainly, as this channel always tries to before any story like this one draws to its own close, exactly where the specific human detail woven through tonight's telling actually comes from, because a battle fought 4.5 centuries ago, however well documented by the standards of its own century, survives to us only through a scattered and unevenly reliable set of accounts, each shaped by its own author's specific loyalties and specific blind spots. A great deal of the Christian side's own detailed narrative comes from participants who wrote or dictated their own accounts in the years immediately following the battle. Venetian chroniclers like Girolamo Diedo and Giovanni Pietro Contarini, both writing with the Republic's own considerable interest in celebrating a victory it had paid so dearly to help win, and Spanish and Italian accounts written by officers who had served under Don Juan's own command and who had, in a great many cases, their own personal reputations and their own personal roles in the battle to protect or to burnish in the telling, sources of real and considerable value precisely because they were written by men who had stood on those same decks, but sources a careful modern historian has to weigh against the plain fact that nearly every one of them had some personal stake in how the story of that single afternoon eventually got told. The Ottoman side of this same story survives in a considerably thinner documentary record, a reflection both of the sheer scale of the material loss the empire suffered that October, records and reports going down with the ships and the men who might otherwise have written them, and of an Ottoman historiographical tradition that tended across this same period to record court and administrative affairs in rather more careful detail than it recorded the specific, ground-level texture of a single battle's own worst hours, though the chronicles of court historians like Selanik'i Mustafa Effendi, writing in the years following the battle, along with surviving Ottoman administrative correspondence, documenting the truly remarkable speed of the fleet's own reconstruction the following spring, give modern historians a genuine, if considerably more fragmentary, window into how Constantinople itself actually understood and actually responded to a defeat its own official chronicles were, understandably, in no particular hurry to dwell on at length. And for the war's own broader strategic shape, the shipbuilding, the treasuries, the diplomacy stretched across Rome, Madrid, Venice, and Constantinople all at once. This account, and a great many modern historians before it, lean heavily on the monumental work of the 20th century French historian Fernand Braudel, whose own sweeping study of the entire Mediterranean world in this same age remains, even where later scholars have pushed back against particular pieces of his own argument, the single most influential attempt ever made to hold the whole of this sprawling, many-sided conflict in view at once, rather than the single afternoon of it, that popular memory has always found easiest to remember. Consider too that modern historians working on the Ottoman side of this same conflict have benefited enormously, across the past half-century especially, from considerably improved access to the Ottoman imperial archives themselves, vast surviving collections of administrative correspondence, financial records, and military dispatches housed in Istanbul that remained, for much of the 20th century, difficult for Western scholars to access and, in a great many cases, difficult even to read without specialised training in Ottoman Turkish's own historical script. A scholarly barrier that meant a great deal of earlier Western writing about this same war leaned considerably more heavily on Christian sources than genuine balance would have preferred, an imbalance that historians working today, with considerably better access and considerably more institutional support for Ottoman archival research, have worked steadily to correct, producing, across recent decades, a considerably richer and considerably more genuinely two-sided account of this war than was available to historians writing even as recently as the middle of the 20th century. It is worth remembering too exactly what banner actually flew from the flagship of the entire Holy League fleet, because the real's own consecrated battle standard, blessed by Pius V himself before the fleet's departure and bearing, as this account has already told you, an image of the crucified Christ, survives to this day, preserved in the Cathedral of Gaeta, on the Italian coast south of Rome, where it remains on display, a single piece of cloth that a visitor can stand before this same week that flew directly above the deck where Don Juan stood directing the battle. This whole account has spent tonight describing one more physical thread alongside the lantern in Madrid and the remains in Venice this account has already told you about, tying a single quiet museum case or church wall in the world as it exists today directly back to the noise and the blood of that one October afternoon. It is worth naming too that the Christian fleet's own considerable haul of captured Ottoman banners, crescent standards taken from the more than 100 vessels seized that afternoon, was distributed in the weeks following the battle among a number of the Italian cities and churches that had contributed most substantially to the Holy League's own cause. Several of these same captured banners still hanging, 4.5 centuries later, in cathedrals and civic buildings across Genoa, Pisa, and a handful of smaller Italian towns, whose own contribution to the fleet a modern visitor might otherwise never guess at. A scattered, unglamorous, and largely unremarked physical inheritance of the battle considerably less famous than Titian's own canvases or Vasari's own frescoes, but no less real for having been largely forgotten by everyone except the specific parish or the specific city hall that has kept its own particular fragment of that October afternoon, hanging quietly on its own wall ever since. It is hard not to notice, finally, that the specific fear this whole account has walked you through tonight, a Christian Europe genuinely uncertain whether Ottoman power might yet reach further into the continent's own heartland, did not end with Lepanto, and would resurface with real and considerable force a little over a century later when an Ottoman army reached the very walls of Vienna itself in 1683, a siege this channel may carry you through in full on another night, and one that a great many contemporary observers, watching Christian forces once again assemble a coalition to relieve a city under Ottoman siege, consciously and explicitly compared to the coalition this whole night has told you about. A reminder that the specific anxiety Lepanto is so often remembered as having permanently resolved was, in the lived experience of the century that actually followed it, never quite as permanently resolved as the statues and the frescoes would have you believe, both hands held open at once on the coalition this story has asked you to admire. This channel has never been comfortable handing you a clean and uncomplicated hero, and Don John of Austria, whatever real courage and real strategic judgment this account has already credited him with tonight, does not actually survive a full and honest accounting as one, because the same young commander who stood at the bow of a skiff, steadying an entire fleet's own courage before the guns opened fire, had, only 3 years earlier, led Spanish forces in the brutal suppression of the Morisco rebellion in the mountains of Granada, a campaign against Spain's own Muslim-descended population, forcibly converted to Christianity a generation earlier and driven, by decades of mounting royal persecution, into open revolt, that Don Juan and his own senior commanders prosecuted with a severity that included, by several surviving accounts, the mass deportation of tens of thousands of Morisco men, women and children from their own ancestral homes, to scattered resettlement across other regions of Spain, a policy of forced displacement that produced real and considerable suffering among a population whose own only crime, in the majority of documented cases, was practicing in private a faith Spain had already outlawed in public. It is worth sitting with the specific and uncomfortable symmetry this same fact produces, because a coalition that assembled itself in 1571 under the explicit banner of defending Christian Europe against Ottoman religious and military expansion was led into its own single greatest victory by a commander who had, within living memory of that same victory, applied a version of exactly the same religious and ethnic suspicion against Muslims living peacefully within Spain's own borders. A reminder this account owes you honestly that the line between a defensive war against foreign conquest and a domestic campaign of religious persecution was, for a great many of the men fighting under the Holy League's own banner, a good deal blurrier in practice than the coalition's own righteous public rhetoric ever admitted. Consider too plainly exactly how each empire's own religious scholars actually constructed the specific doctrinal case for this war, because both sides drew in this respect on centuries-old and genuinely sophisticated legal traditions, rather than on any improvised wartime rhetoric invented for the occasion. The Ottoman jurist Ebu Suud Effendi's own fatwa, this account has already told you, rested on an established body of Islamic legal reasoning concerning the reconquest of formerly Muslim-held territory and the specific legal status of a peace treaty broken by the other party's own prior provocations, a body of doctrine considerably more careful and considerably more procedurally rigorous than the simple word jihad, holy struggle, tends to suggest to a modern listener unfamiliar with the actual legal tradition behind it. the Catholic Church's own doctrine of a just war against the Ottoman Empire drew, in almost exactly parallel fashion, on a legal and theological tradition, stretching back through the Crusades this channel has already told you about in full on other nights, through Augustine's own foundational writing on the conditions under which Christian warfare could be morally justified, a tradition that had, by the 16th century, developed its own considerable body of careful theological argument about proportionality, just cause, and legitimate authority, doctrine every bit as elaborate in its own separate religious vocabulary as the Ottoman legal reasoning Abu Su'ud Effendi drew on. It is worth naming, honestly, that both of these considerable intellectual traditions, for all their own genuine internal sophistication, arrived, in this specific case as in a great many others across both religions' own long histories, at conclusions that happened to align rather conveniently with what each ruling court had already decided, on more practical grounds, that it wanted to do. A specific and recurring pattern this channel has shown you before, and will very likely show you again. Religious doctrine capable of restraining rulers in principle, proving, in the actual crucible of a specific war, a court has already resolved to fight, remarkably flexible in practice. It is worth sitting too with exactly how much of this whole story actually turned on chance, rather than on any commander's own foresight or virtue, because a battle this consequential rests, when you look closely enough at it, on a genuinely uncomfortable number of near accidents that could easily have broken the other way. A war council that had listened to Doria's own caution rather than Venier's own insistence might never have sought battle at all that autumn, sailing home instead to a winter of recrimination and a spring campaign the rebuilding Ottoman fleet might have met on considerably more favourable terms of its own choosing. A wind that rose rather than stayed calm that October morning might have stripped both fleets of the oar-powered manoeuvrability this account has already told you the entire battle depended on, turning a fight the galleass's cannon fire helped decide within its opening minutes into a considerably longer and considerably less lopsided contest. A musket ball that struck a few inches differently might have spared Ali Pasha's own life, denying the Christian centre the collapse in Ottoman morale that single death produced, or might just as easily have found Don Juan himself, standing, as this account has already told you, visibly exposed at his own flagship's rail, through hours of close fighting, a 24-year-old commander's own death at the height of the battle that would have thrown the entire Christian coalition into a crisis of command no one had adequately planned for. None of this is offered to diminish the real courage this whole account has asked you to admire tonight. In Barbarigo holding his own line after an arrow took his eye, in Cervantes rising from a sickbed he had every reasonable excuse to stay in a Grand Master at Malta 6 years earlier who would not let a fortress fall while he himself still stood, but only to name honestly, as this channel has tried to name honestly in every other story it has ever carried you through, that courage and chance were never actually separable in the outcome this whole night has been building toward, and that a great many of the men whose own names this account has asked you to remember owe at least as much to a wind that happened to stay calm, and a bullet that happened to find one specific man's chest rather than another's, as they owe to any virtue historians have spent 4.5 centuries crediting them with since. And it is worth naming with the same honesty that Ottoman conduct across this same broader conflict, the sack of Nicosia, the flaying of Bragadin, the systematic enslavement this account has already walked you through in detail, gives the same lie to any comfortable notion that either side of this war held any meaningful monopoly on cruelty, because both empires locked in this contest were, in the plainest and least romantic sense available, expanding, extracting and enslaving according to their own separate religious and political logics, and the men who died at Lepanto died, in the overwhelming majority of individual cases, not because they had personally chosen either cruelty or virtue, but because two much larger imperial machines above them had each decided for reasons of state that had almost nothing to do with any individual oarsman's own conscience, that this particular stretch of water was worth killing and dying over. the corsair economy that shaped an entire coastline's daily fear. It is worth returning, before this account moves toward its own close, to the ordinary people. This whole story has spent most of its own telling moving past in favour of sultans, popes and admirals, because the specific and sustained terror this account described earlier, coastal villages watching for raiding sails, is worth dwelling on a little longer in its own right, since it shaped the daily lives of considerably more people across this same century than any single battle, however large, ever directly touched. An entire and genuinely remarkable charitable infrastructure grew up across Catholic Europe specifically to address this same ongoing crisis. Religious orders, chief among them the Trinitarians and the Mercedarians, founded centuries earlier during the crusading period, this channel has already told you about on other nights, that devoted themselves, by the 16th century, almost entirely to the specific and dangerous work of travelling to Algiers, Tunis and Constantinople to negotiate the ransom of Christian captives held there, raising funds through public collection across parishes all over Catholic Europe, funds that, across the 16th and 17th centuries combined, purchased freedom for tens of thousands of individual captives, men and women whose own names, unlike the sultans and admirals this account has spent so much of tonight following, survive where they survive at all, only in the fragmentary ransom ledgers these same religious orders kept, a specific and human ledger of ordinary suffering and ordinary rescue running alongside the grander imperial story. This whole night has been telling you a ledger this same charitable infrastructure would go on maintaining generation after generation for the better part of 2 more centuries after the single battle this whole night has been building toward, because the corsair economy that produced the need for it did not end at Lepanto, or at the Treaty of 1573, or even at the Truce of 1580, but continued in one form or another until European naval power finally overwhelmed the Barbary states outright in the early decades of the 19th century. A full 250 years still to run past the single afternoon this account has spent tonight walking you through in such careful and such bloody detail. It is worth remembering too exactly how these same redemption missions actually operated once a ransoming friar arrived in a city like Algiers or Tunis, because the negotiation itself was a slow, delicate and often genuinely dangerous business. Friars travelling under specific safe conduct arrangements negotiated in advance with local authorities, carrying with them sums of money raised, coin by coin, through years of parish collections back home, and working, once they arrived, through local intermediaries to identify which captives among the thousands held in any given port city's own slave markets and private households. Their own available funds might actually be able to purchase, a process that could stretch across weeks or months of careful negotiation, and that left, in every single case, a great many more captives unredeemed than redeemed simply because the money available never came close to matching the scale of the need, a specific and recurring heartbreak. This same charitable system produced generation after generation, friars forced, again and again, to choose which handful of names on a very long list they could actually afford to bring home. It is hard not to notice too that this same ransom economy ran, as nearly every economy touched by this long Mediterranean rivalry eventually did, in both directions at once, because Muslim captives taken in Christian raids and naval victories, including a considerable number taken in the aftermath of Lepanto itself, faced their own version of the same slave markets, the same convict galley sentences, and, where families or communities could raise the funds, their own versions of ransom and redemption, a genuinely symmetrical human traffic in captured bodies that both empires participated in with equal enthusiasm, and that neither side's own religious framing of this conflict, a Christian crusade against Ottoman aggression on one side, a jihad to reclaim lands once held by earlier Muslim rule on the other, ever really acknowledged as the shared and mutual practice it plainly was. It is worth naming, plainly, exactly how the actual mechanics of ransom worked for a captive fortunate enough to have any hope of it at all. because a captive's own price varied enormously according to a calculus that had almost nothing to do with the captive's own humanity and everything to do with perceived value. A nobleman or an officer commanding a price that could run into the thousands of ducats, reflecting both his own family's presumed ability to pay and the specific prestige his own capture conferred on whichever corsair or naval officer had taken him, while an ordinary sailor or a peasant conscript, lacking any family capable of raising a meaningful ransom, might spend the whole of his own remaining life at the oar or in domestic slavery, never ransomed at all, simply because nobody with sufficient means had any particular reason to spend it on him. A specific and brutal economic logic that meant a captive's own survival and eventual freedom depended considerably less on luck or on divine favour than on the plain accident of what social rank he had happened to be born into before he was ever taken. It is worth remembering, too, what became of the considerable number of Cypriot refugees who managed to flee the island ahead of its own final Ottoman conquest, because Venetian ships evacuated a meaningful number of the island's own wealthier Latin Catholic families in the weeks before Famagusta's own fall, carrying them to Venetian Crete and onward, in many cases, to Venice itself, where a small community of Cypriot exiles maintained its own distinct identity and its own hopes, never realised, of an eventual return, for at least a generation afterward, a specific and human echo of the same displacement this channel has already shown you on other nights, following nearly every conquest and every collapse it has ever carried you through. Families who carried an island's own name and an island's own grief into a permanent exile that the Treaty of 1573, signed by men who had never set foot on Cyprus at all, made permanent without ever once consulting them, an island's peasants, and the ledger that changed hands but did not disappear. It is worth returning, too, to Cyprus itself, and to the specific question of what actually happened to the island's own ordinary Greek-speaking Orthodox Christian population once Ottoman administration replaced Venetian colonial rule for good under the terms of the 1573 treaty, because the answer complicates, in a way this channel has never shied away from, any simple story of Christian loss and Muslim conquest. A number of modern historians working from surviving Ottoman tax and land records have documented that Ottoman administration, whatever its own considerable faults, actually abolished the specific feudal labour obligations the island's Latin Catholic Venetian landlords had maintained across the preceding 8 decades, restored a measure of institutional standing to the island's own Greek Orthodox Church that Venice's Latin Catholic administration had systematically marginalised and imposed, at least in the war's immediate aftermath, a tax burden on the island's own peasantry that a meaningful body of surviving evidence suggests was, in certain specific respects, lighter than the burden Venetian rule had imposed, a genuinely uncomfortable complication for any reading of this war as a simple story of a Christian population liberated by a Christian victory from a Muslim conqueror, because the actual Christian population living on the ground in Cyprus experienced their own change of ruling empire in terms considerably more mixed, and in some documented respects more favourable, than the battle this whole night has been building toward would suggest to anyone who stopped the story at October the 7th and never asked what happened to the island itself afterward. A battle remembered very differently depending on which shore raised you. It is worth remembering, honestly, before this account lets you rest in the single, triumphant version of this story, that Venice, Rome, and Madrid all told about themselves in the years immediately following the battle, that Lepanto occupies a considerably smaller and considerably more equivocal place in Turkish historical memory than it does in the popular memory of southern Europe, and that this difference is not simply a matter of national pride refusing to dwell on a defeat, but reflects, in its own way, the same strategic reality. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha's own remark about a beard and an arm was reaching for at the time. A battle that felt, from Constantinople's own vantage point once the fleet had been rebuilt, and the war concluded on terms that left Cyprus firmly in Ottoman hands, considerably less like the civilization-defining catastrophe European commemoration would spend the following centuries insisting it had been. and considerably more like a single, costly, but ultimately contained setback inside a war the empire had, by any reasonable accounting of its own stated war aims, actually won. Modern Turkish historical scholarship has, across recent decades, engaged with the battle in more sustained and more critical detail than earlier nationalist historiography on either side of this old divide generally allowed. But the underlying asymmetry in how prominently this single afternoon features in each nation's own popular historical memory, a defining statue and fresco-worthy triumph in Spain, Italy and Greece alike, a genuinely significant but considerably less central chapter in the story Turkey tells about this same Ottoman century, remains a real and instructive reminder that the same 4 hours of fighting this account has walked you through tonight can occupy two entirely different sizes in two different nations' own sense of their own history, depending on which side of the Gulf, in the most literal sense, your own ancestors happen to be standing on. A parallel massacre this same channel has to name in a country that was not at war with either empire. It is worth naming too a specific and genuinely startling coincidence of timing. This account would be doing you a disservice to leave out, because less than a year after the Christian world's own celebration of Lepanto had begun to quiet, in the last days of August, 1572, the Kingdom of France, a Catholic power that had taken no part whatsoever in the Holy League and had, if anything, maintained its own long and pragmatic diplomatic friendship with Constantinople across most of the preceding century, erupted into a massacre of its own, Catholic mobs and royal forces alike killing thousands of French Protestants in Paris, and in a wave of subsequent violence that spread to provincial cities across the kingdom in the weeks that followed, an atrocity remembered as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and worth naming here. Briefly and without turning this account into the story of an entirely separate conflict this channel may tell in full on another night, only because it stands as a genuinely sobering reminder that the specific horrors this account has walked you through tonight, a massacre at Nicosia, a flaying at Famagusta, a slaughter of drowning men in a Gulf's own bloodied water, were never uniquely Ottoman, never uniquely Christian, and never confined to the single war this account has spent tonight describing, but belonged, in the broadest and most uncomfortable sense, to an entire 16th century world in which religious difference, on every side of every border then standing in Europe and the Mediterranean alike, could and regularly did become a license for exactly this same scale of killing. What a visitor can still find, if they know where to look. Consider too, before this long night story finally winds its own way toward a close, exactly how much of this same battle you could still go and stand beside, in the world as it actually exists this week, if the specific pull of this story ever carried you toward the airports and the train stations rather than only towards sleep. The small Greek coastal town the Venetians called Lepanto still stands at the mouth of that same gulf, known today by its own older Greek name, Naupaktos, a quiet fishing and university town whose own small Venetian-built harbour, walled and circular and still very much in daily use by local fishing boats, sits almost entirely unchanged from the shape it held on the morning this whole account has spent tonight describing, a genuinely strange experience, by the account of more than one modern traveller, to stand on quiet, sun-warmed stone and try to reconcile it with the scale of violence this single night has just walked you through only a short distance out into the water beyond it, a small stone lighthouse marking the harbour's own narrow entrance today, and a hillside fortress rising above the modern town that predates the battle by centuries and has watched, from its own quiet vantage point, every ship that has entered or left that same gulf since long before Don Juan's own fleet ever appeared on its own horizon. In Madrid, the Museo Naval preserves, among its own considerable collection, the ornate carved and gilded stern lantern once mounted on Don Juan's own flagship the Real, salvaged and preserved across 4.5 centuries specifically because it had lit the deck of the ship that led the Christian fleet into this same battle, a single physical object a visitor can stand directly in front of this week that was, in the most literal sense, present in that gulf on the 7th of October, 1571. In Venice, Bragadina's own remains still rest inside the monument this account has already told you about, at the church of Santi Giovanni e Paolo, and in Rome, Vasari's own frescoes still cover the ceiling of the papal apartments he decorated to commemorate Pius V's role in the victory. Both open, in the ordinary way most churches and museums are open, to any visitor who wishes to see them. And Cyprus itself, the island whose own loss this entire long war was fought over, remains, in the world as it stands this week still formally divided, a partition line running through its own capital city that dates not from this 16th century war but from a considerably more recent conflict in 1974, a division this account is not going to walk you through in any further detail tonight, only naming it plainly because an island fought over this bitterly in the century this whole story has told you about has, in its own way, never entirely stopped being fought over since. It is worth remembering, one final time before this account lets the story close, that nearly every figure this long night has introduced you to, a young sultan remembered for his wine, a Venetian governor remembered for his skin, a maimed novelist, a bastard prince, a corsair turned grand admiral, a grand vizier who understood the difference between a beard and an arm better than the men currently celebrating around him, believed at the specific moment each of them acted that they were doing something the moment itself required of them, and it was only the slow accumulation of all of those separate human-specific choices made in council chambers and on burning decks and inside a besieged fortress's own crumbling walls that built across 3 years a single afternoon large enough that 4.5 centuries of retelling still has not fully exhausted it, and large enough too that it has never once settled, in all those same 4.5 centuries, into the single tidy lesson any one nation's own statues have ever quite managed to fit it inside. Let us walk back once more through the whole shape of what this long night has actually carried you through, because a story with this many names and this many separate battles deserves, before it finally lets you go, one last clear look at its own complete outline. It began, long before any cannon ever fired across the Gulf of Patras, with an Ottoman Empire that had spent a century pushing its own naval power steadily westward across the Mediterranean, a momentum built by Barbarossa's own victory at Preveza and tested for the first time in a generation by the failure of Suleiman's own ageing fleet outside the walls of Malta in 1565. It moved through a new sultan, Selim II, remembered unfairly or not for a taste in wine that popular legend would eventually blame for an entire war, and through the considerably more sober, strategic, religious, and political calculations that actually drove his own court toward a war against Venice over a single wealthy island. It moved through Cyprus itself, through the fall of Nicosia and a massacre that killed some 15,000 to 20,000 people in a single day, through 11 desperate months at Famagusta, and through Marco Antonio Bragadin's own surrender, betrayal, and death. A single act of broken faith whose own shockwaves did more than any other single event to finally drag a fractured and mutually suspicious Christian coalition into existence. It moved through Pope Pius V's own patient diplomacy, through a Holy League stitched together out of Spanish caution, Venetian urgency, and papal religious fervour all at once, and through the surprising choice of a 24-year-old illegitimate prince, Don John of Austria, to lead the largest combined fleet Christian Europe had assembled in living memory. It moved through the gathering at Messina, through the genuine and considerable difficulty of holding together a coalition whose own component parts trusted one another only barely, and through a war council's own decision, made against real and reasoned caution, to seek out and fight an Ottoman fleet many still believed unbeatable. And it moved at last through a single October morning of near total calm, through 6 galleasses whose own concentrated cannon fire shattered an Ottoman formation before the lines ever closed, through Barbarigo's death and Sirocco's annihilation on the northern flank, through Ali Pasha's own death at the centre and the collapse of Ottoman command that followed it, through Uluç Ali's own skillful escape on the southern flank, and through an afternoon's final hours of slaughter and rescue tangled together in the same reddened water, leaving some 25 to 30,000 men dead by evening, thousands more still chained below decks on ships that never surfaced again, 10 to 12,000 Christian captives freed from Ottoman ore benches, and a victory that all of Catholic Europe would spend the following week celebrating as though it had settled. For good, a contest that the following 18 months and the following century would show had settled rather less than anyone celebrating in October and November of 1571 allowed themselves to believe. Thank you, as always, sincerely and warmly, for spending part of your own night in this room with me. If this long, unhurried telling gave you something worth carrying into whatever hours of sleep are still ahead of you, consider liking this video and subscribing. And if you would like to help this small channel along its own way toward 10,000 subscribers, know that every one of you listening tonight is already doing exactly that simply by being here. If you found this story on YouTube, the link to hear it early on Spotify for Creators is waiting for you down in the description. And if Spotify carried you here instead, go find Historian at Midnight on YouTube and subscribe there too, so that this small and growing audience, split as it currently is across 2 platforms, can keep finding its own way back together. And if you would like to leave some small trace of yourself behind before you drift off, drop your city and your local time in the comments. Nothing more than that, because there is something quietly good about knowing that somewhere else on this turning planet, under a sky entirely different from your own, another tired stranger just spent their own night in this same narrow gulf with you. Close your eyes now, gently, if you have not already let them fall shut somewhere back around that first fevered soldier climbing out of his own sickbed, insisting on a post nobody would have blamed him for refusing. Let the water settle. Let the smoke finally clear. Let every gun in that gulf fall silent at last, because that is where every long night this channel has ever carried you through eventually arrives, at a stillness on the other side of all that noise. Whatever it is that is pressing on you tonight, whatever argument or worry or unfinished list is still sitting somewhere just behind your own closed eyes, let it grow smaller now, smaller than an island, smaller than an empire, small enough, at last, to finally set down. Good night and sweet dreams.